going to be here. Tracy will not be here, neither will Brad. So, yeah, you take up a lot of space, guy. So, Happy New Year to everybody. We'll get the January 10th meeting going. First item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from last time, which was November. I was not there. A second. All those in favor? All right. Second item, public comments. I don't know if we have any commenters from the public and or communications from our community members. Anybody have anything of interest?
It didn't have to be of interest.
Well, no, not necessarily, but I would appreciate it.
I was going to say something, but no, I don't.
Moving on to items 3 and 4, they're both consent. I did have one request of information on number 3, and it's just kind of a status of the MOA with, I guess it's U.S. Fish and Wildlife and California Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah, so currently Sandac has an MOA in place with Caltrans, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and also the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and that just describes how we're going to implement the Transnet EMP going forward. So that was originally signed in 2008. It's going to expire spring of this year. So Keith Greer, who's the principal in our department, is going to start coordinating with those other agencies in the springtime. And then I believe that will be coming through the ITALC for a review and a discussion in the summer of this year.
Okay. Thank you very much. Does anybody else have anything on items 3 and or 4?
Yeah, on 4, I'd raise the question of what staff's position or justification, if you will, for the idea that the city of Coronado, what I think is a 2-year program, is going to need a 35-month extension. Does that make sense? Is that still the best use of those funds?
So we here in the grant program have been wondering the same thing. We've been monitoring this project very closely over the last few months. In fact, last month we met with Councilman Sankey, the city manager of Coronado Blair King, and then the project staff to discuss the performance. They're very interested in it as well. What we determined internally is we want to bring this project to this committee and then the transportation committee in the next month or so to discuss it a little bit more.
So you have not reached a decision yet?
We've not reached a decision, but we'll be probably having another discussion in the next month or so with you all.
Clearly there's a question they've spent some of the money, so we have some costs, and we walk away from that. And
as I mentioned in the report, it was a new project, so they just had some significant startup costs. And they've been working pretty diligently at meeting their performance indicators, but they're just behind.
We'll wait for the rest of the story. Thank you.
Additional questions, comments on 3 and 4? If not,
actually, I just had a question on relating to the senior mini grant program. I'm worried, has Sandac itself looked at the question of whether Sandac in the sort of a master service provider concept could provide services more efficiently, perhaps less costly than outsourcing all these individual little contracts? Has there ever been a look-see at whether trying to create a kind of a master service provider would be a beneficial concept?
Well, the ordinance says that it's a competitive grant program
Right.
For nonprofits and then local agencies. So really we just work within that Transnet ordinance language. And I don't know, maybe Colleen can speak to if we've ever considered that.
Yeah. One of the things we're actually looking at right now as part of the update to the regional plan is we're working on a specialized transportation strategy. And so that's really looking at all of these different programs and thinking about what is the greater need, where should resources be focused. So that's one effort that's going on, kind of looking at this globally. We're also getting ready for the next call for projects. And the Transnet ordinance does specify the senior mini grant program and that it be the funds be allocated in a competitive way. But I think you're raising a good point. should the grants be, should it be just like one large grant, one lump sum, there's roughly $1 million a year, should that just go to one entity that Sandag oversees instead of lots of little ones? Or are we better off with a whole bunch of little ones? Those are some of the things that we'll be bringing forward to you as we talk about the call for projects and the strategic plan for kind of overall specialized transportation.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of this in the context particularly of the 10-year review.
Yeah.
Where looking at these kinds of things and the effectiveness of, you know, lots of little grants versus trying to create, you know, or support the creation of a master entity that might have greater economy of scale, efficiency, and whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So, just a thought.
Those are good points for us to be thinking about.
Okay, thanks.
That's a very interesting question, particularly when you reference the 10-year look back. And the 10-year look back tries to benchmark us against several other entities in different benchmarks. I'm wondering if they have any information in their database whether that approach has been taken elsewhere to achieve similar type things with senior mobility and such. Is there any knowledge about what others do in this area?
Well, that is one of the things that we're looking at in this overall strategy. We're looking at some peer regions that have similar responsibilities. How do they administer programs? So we will be looking at that, whether or not the 10-year look back
But you're doing it.
did that, but we're doing that.
Even better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is for information items. Do we need to do? We'll move on to item number 5, summary of Transportation Committee and Board action. Our Board of Director actions. Ariane.
Yes, your last meeting was in November, and since then, the Board of Directors authorized execution of a contract with CPS HR Consulting to conduct the recruitment for our next executive director. At this Friday's board meeting, the board is scheduled to discuss a work plan and community engagement for the recruitment effort. The Transportation Committee also received the Smart Growth Incentive Grant Program and ENP Land Management quarterly status update that are on your agenda today, in addition to an overview of the financial markets, quarterly financial report, and quarterly status on transportation projects, which were all on your agenda last November. In addition, the Transportation Committee approved a 7-month extension for Mountain Health Community Services Volunteer Driver Program, which was recommended for approval by the ITOC at its November meeting. They also recommended and the board approved both the Smart Growth Incentive and the Active Transportation Calls for Projects, which you also reviewed at your meeting in November. The City of La Mesa's use of Sandag Commercial Paper Program was recommended by the Transportation Committee and approved by the board, and you also reviewed that back in November. The Transit Operations Funding report was reviewed by the Transportation Committee. You're going to hear more about that as part of today's agenda. And then last week, the Transportation Committee received a report on the Transnet 10-year comprehensive review, which is on your agenda today as well, as you know. And then finally, regarding AB 805 implementation, the board approved a new policy for a new audit advisory committee. And also request for audit committee member applications is currently underway. And then the audit committee is expected to have its first meeting in April. And then last but not least, we presented a draft of the State of the Commute report a few months ago. And so the final, I know we emailed that out to everybody, to the group here, but we also have a hard copy at your seats, just so you can have that as well.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Randy, can you just expand a bit on the search for the new director? What's the timetable? You stated a couple steps there. It sounded like they were very early on steps, but how
Yeah, I
long
think
is it?
Kim is better.
I can address that. So really, January is going to be devoted for community engagement and outreach. This Friday, actually, the board is the consultant from CPS HR. Her name is Pamela Derby. She is coming to kind of explain what she's been doing to date, and it's also a time at this board meeting for the public to weigh in on the draft position description for the executive director. Draft has been put together with, you know, the competencies and the knowledge and skills. So to take testimony here, there will be 5 public engagement sessions, workshops, listening sessions, basically around the county over January. We'll send you a link afterwards. So there's 5 public sessions, one in Encinitas, Escondido, Chula Vista, City of San Diego, and I'm missing one, Santee.
That's the
We
speaker.
received that yesterday. I think.
Yeah, we got an
Did you
email.
send it?
That's the speaker.
There were no addresses
That's
though.
Okay, they're at the city halls, we'll make sure.
Okay.
That speaks to the position description, that's the purpose of.
Yeah, the
community.
position, what are the characteristics that the next executive director should be? So that's what's happening there. There's also, we have 5 sessions with Sandag employees. There's also a link for the folks that can't attend or don't want to attend. There's a link to a survey, an online anonymous survey, that basically you can weigh in as well. So really January is devoted on kind of getting information, getting public input, employee input, stakeholder input on, what are the characteristics for the next executive director. The consultant will come to our board retreat in February, which is February 9th, Friday, and kind of summarize what's been discussed to date. We're expecting then the board to release the job announcements will be posted probably about mid-February. So February and March will really be the time where she's actively, culling through candidates and looking through those. The goal is the recruitment subcommittee, which is a subset of the board, will interview candidates sort of in the late March, early April timeframe. And the goal is to have it at the board meeting, the board to interview the short list of folks and make a decision at the end of the meeting. So that's what.
Person might be on board May, June, depending on.
Yeah, depending on.
Location.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's the schedule right now. So, what I would do is encourage, you guys to weigh in to the extent possible, or send in, if you have folks that would be interested to actually send out the links or send out the information to the survey or the meetings, survey or the folks that you know.
Subcommittee of the board will integrate all this input, so they get a ton of input from all these different sessions.
Right.
Come up with a final document, that's their
Yeah,
document.
and they will interview, kind of a larger set to narrow it down to a short list of the full board would review. So we have about, our chair is serving to, Terry Sinnock with Del Mar, Councilman from Del Mar, serving as the chair of the recruitment subcommittee, and we have Mayor Faulkner, Supervisor Cox, Mayor Minto from Santee, Mayor Blakespeare from Encinitas, Mayor Salas from Chula Vista, and Mayor Abbott from Escondido, all in the subcommittees. There's regional representation.
Anytime we're in good hands.
As long as they can find somebody that fits what everybody wants.
One person, you can walk across the river.
Yeah.
No problem.
Any other questions, comments on item number 5? Then moving on to number 6, Kathy and Dan and Michael for the 10-year comprehensive review. I'm not sure if this is the appropriate time to mention this. We did have a little discussion in our pre-meeting call with Ariana. I think we do have an opportunity to draft a memo.
Yeah, I was going to address that.
What's that?
I was going to address that.
Oh, no, I'll let you do it then.
Yeah, okay. So, so as our chair just introduced the team, and some of you I think have already worked with Schober Gavish and Consulting. We have Leanne Liu, who will be leading the presentation, and then we have Michael Nash, who will also be providing part of the presentation, and then Kathy Brady as well. Many of you have worked with her in prior audits as well, so she'll be here to answer questions as well. So I just wanted to preface before they begin, and as you're going to hear as part of the presentation, the reason that we're here today, of course, is that the Transnet Extension Ordinance requires this, overall comprehensive review of the program every 10 years to evaluate performance. And as we shared with you in November, the board elected to conduct the 10-year review as a 2-step process. First, a look back at the performance, of the program, and then a look forward, kind of to see, what improvements can be made to the program. Not only for the next 10 years, but for 30 years through the end of the measure, to look at any improvements that could either be made to the expenditure plan or other ordinance areas. And today's presentation covers just the look back portion, including some preliminary future considerations based on the results of the look back component that will be expanded on as part of today's item. For the look ahead component, depending on the nature of any potential improvements that the board may consider, For any of those proposed changes, those would be brought back either as part of the regional plan update or as standalone items for the board's review. For example, proposed changes to the expenditure plan, those might be considered as part of the upcoming transportation network scenario development process that is typically, done as part of the regional plan update, or for changes that are specific to other ordinance areas, for example, changes to the EMP. Those could be brought back as separate items without having to wait for the regional plan to be adopted by the board. Another item that this report addresses is a specific request that was made by the board in October to provide Transnet project cost estimate and expenditure information in a simplified format. And that is Appendix B to the report, so the team will be going over that matrix. Also, you may recall that the 10-year review was originally scheduled to be presented to the board in December. And I talked in January, but now the report is scheduled to go to the board at the end of this month on January 26th. And so far, we've presented this report to the Regional Planning Committee, the Transportation Committee, the EMP Working Group, and we're going to be sharing the feedback from those groups at the board meeting at the end of January. And then finally, as a reminder, as our chair was just letting us know, at its November meeting, ITAC members had elected to provide recommendations for improvements as part of the performance audit, which you are currently conducting. And as opposed to conveying, your comments or recommendations as a separate memo. But ITAC recommendations can still be captured that way. And in addition, staff can relay your comments from today at the board meeting on January 26th as well. And that would still be consistent with the ITAC role, which is to provide recommendations as part of the 10-year review process. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let the team begin.
Good morning. As you know, we are your ITAC performance auditors, but today we're wearing the hat of the Transnet 10-year look back reviewers. So Ariana did a lot of introductions already. I'm not going to repeat a lot of that. So maybe if we just want to take a moment and look at what we'll be covering today. It's really, we'll briefly discuss the 10-year review requirement, which Ariana mostly covered already. We'll refresh our memories on what the Transnet goals are, just to keep those in mind as we're looking back at the past 10 years. And then we'll be sharing with you the results of the review, which we weren't able to do at the November meeting. And then item 9, there will be some look-forward considerations that we'll recommend for CNDAG to consider when they're doing the 2019 regional plan update. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll have questions and answers. We'll have to do that at the end. But if you can interrupt if you have any questions in between. So there we go. So the objectives that the board set for us in doing the 10-year look-back review was really looking at all of the projects and programs that were implemented since 2008, as well as the 3-year period going back to January 2005 when the Early Action Program was implemented. And then the look-back review was not just intended to recap what has happened in the past 10 years, but also provide a look-forward section. So that will happen, as Ariana mentioned, as part of the regional plan update. Those future considerations will incorporate it into that, and that will be brought forward to you, I think, early or late next year. So as you can imagine, going back 10 years to collect and analyze data is challenging. As such, the board asked us to not recreate the wheel, really, and use existing materials and data and aggregate that information. Which brings us to the next slide. We want to emphasize that the 10-year look-back review is not an audit. It is a review. We were asked just to compile information and data that was available, but on the Transnet Triennial Performance Audit side, that's where we're going to do a little bit more testing and in-depth review. So just to clarify that a little bit. But with that said, though, some of the data presented was provided by CNDAG through various reports and reporting tools, such as the dashboard. But much of the performance data came from external agencies and databases, such as Caltrans, the local jurisdictions, CHP, census data, as well as other transportation industry-wide used standard performance data, or reports provided by the Texas A&M Transportation Institute or for Transit, the National Transit Database. And then additionally, some of the data used came from our prior audits where we tested informations and systems. If you're interested, Appendix A of the report has a full descriptions of our review methodology. It's quite lengthy too. So given the objectives and data collections efforts, we were really asked to look into 3 primary areas. The first was an evaluation of performance that included an analysis of projects completed, those underway, and whatever's left to be done, the cost that is needed to complete those projects, and the revenues that are expected to be available over the next 30 years. We were also asked to look at and evaluate the use of debt to accelerate projects, leveraging of Transnet funds with other funds, and compliance of allocating Transnet funds in accordance with ordinance requirements. The second area is the evaluation of financial capacity. It's really looking at the continuing implementing the ordinance by looking at the transition from debt issuance to the pay-go financing method, fiscal challenges and opportunities, and then current revenue projections, assumptions, and costs. The last area asked us to identify any external policies and regulations changes that may impact Transnet. We have new federal requirements, MAP 21 and the FAST Act, but there's also funding opportunities under SB 1, and then any potential impacts of what's called disruptive technologies, your autonomous cars and connected vehicles. So that's kind of in a nutshell the main scope and focus areas for the 10-year look-back review. So with that review scope in mind, we would like to refresh everyone's memory of what the key Transnet goals were. And the items that you have on this slide are actually straight from the November 2004 Transit Extension ballot, which we have a picture of on page 7 of the report. So the main 3 Transnet goals were to expand your freeway corridors, maintain or improve local streets and roads, expand commuter services, match state federal funds, increase transit for seniors and those with disabilities, relieve congestion, and improve safety. To achieve those Transnet goals, the ordinance provided that the sales tax revenues have to be allocated to each Transnet area following a specific percentage or amount. So as you can see on this slide, and I apologize, it's a little bit blurry, but you know that the majority of Transnet revenues, 38%, goes towards your capital major corridor construction, and then there's 29% that goes towards the local streets and roads program, so that's more than half. And then there's other programs that receive lesser amounts, such as your 2.5% for specialized services for seniors and disabled, or 3.25% for like your senior mini grants. So just to keep that perspective in mind as we're going and sharing the results with you. So, well, what is it that Transnet has accomplished in the past 10 years? I think the biggest takeaway is to realize that only a quarter of the time has passed, and CNDAG and its Transnet partners have completed or are in progress on 61% of the 48 major capital corridor projects that were outlined in ordinance. And then there was also money provided to other activities like transit operations, local streets and roads, and your environmental mitigation program. A lot of these accomplished that are listed here were made during a decade of significant changes in the transportation landscape. You know, we have ride-sharing services, your Ubers and your Lyfts, new technologies such as autonomous cars and connected vehicles. And then we also had the Great Recession that nobody thought would happen. So while some accomplishments were are highlighted on this slide, it's probable that Transnet has realized more than can be measured because a comprehensive tracking system was not put in place when the ordinance passed in 2004. There's probably many more accomplishments than are listed on this slide and in the report. Listed on this slide and yes.
If I could just ask for context, would you happen to know, even just generally, for some of the statistics you mentioned, for example, 107 transit revenue miles added, 17 miles of rail, do you know what the sort of the base numbers were to get some context as to how significant the enhancements were? If you understand what I'm asking?
Right, so in perspective with what was
How many
set
miles
out.
were proposed?
What was the starting point
Yeah.
for some of those metrics to give some context as to whether, you know,
Certain percentage
a
is
huge
taken
amount
care
was
of.
done or a relatively small percentage was added?
Yeah, with the data that was available, we didn't have some of those starting numbers
Gotcha.
to be able to provide that sort of context for you.
So in addition to these outputs or accomplishments that you saw on the previous slide, we also evaluated performance related to Transnet goals of congestion relief, safety, pavement, and transit. We looked at San Diego, the region's performance over the past 10-year period, comparing them to themselves, but also against other comparable regions or areas. So in the next few slides, you will see a variety of comparison areas that were selected, starting with federal census population data, considering factors such as proximity to San Diego, tourism, climate, and geographical coastal areas. But due to the nature of the available data to benchmark and compare San Diego's performance, the areas that were selected and the time periods available varied. So for some metrics, data was available at the census urbanized level, whereas other metrics were available at the county or Caltrans district level. And then some reports or external databases had data for the entire 10-year review period, while other data was only available for a subset of years. But to the extent possible, we tried to keep comparison areas similar, as well as cover the entire 10-year review period for the data. It's just if you're seeing shorter time frames, it's because the data was not readily available. And then, there's volumes of performance metrics that can be evaluated. We really focused on region-wide measures and the more common ones that were used in the industry. So today's PowerPoint presentation will highlight a few of those metrics, in particular the ones that you can see on page 8 to 10 of the report that are the report highlights. And there's many more charts and data that is in the body of the report that we're happy to discuss if you have any questions. So overall, though, the data gathered showed that the Transnet program has addressed some of the challenges related to congestion relief, safety, and infrastructure, and performed favorably in a variety of areas and measured and against peer comparison areas as well.
I just had a question just relating to some of these. Why wasn't Orange County or LA chosen, just because since they're immediately adjacent?
Yeah, so we really started with the federal census data and starting with the population and just trying to get the urbanized areas, again, that we're talking about, a couple above and a couple below. LA is way outside the ballpark. It's just not even comparable. Orange County it was a few up. So it was just really just trying to take, in a short period of time, those ones and show some comparisons. And those are the ones that came out two above in terms of population and coastal general centers of tourism. Although some of the ones that were lower, I think Minneapolis was one that was like right next to population of San Diego, and we took that out because of the snow factors. Just so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ones you can use. They're not necessarily maybe a peer region, but they're comparables, and we pulled those before we pulled any information for them.
A follow-up question on that. I guess it's because the book, it's the next chart, where instead of having these different cities, you list districts.
And the page number you're on, sorry.
And page 8.
Caltrans districts.
Is that what those are?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yes.
I couldn't find a definition of what those were and where we are in them.
Both
Oh.
sides, I know we're 11.
And I can,
That's us?
Go ahead.
District 11, I guess.
I had one comment on this chart. Again, it's chartsmanship a bit, but that shows an improvement, which is wonderful. And in 10 years, we had a 2% improvement after all these hundreds of millions of dollars. And I don't know whether there's any commentary or whether there should be any commentary on whether that turned out to be an effective investment for a 2% increase, in 2% improvement. And quite frankly, anecdotal evidence would say there hasn't been any improvement. One got here would be at 805 or 5 today.
Depending on your specific.
It actually didn't improve, it got worse.
Yeah.
It's the percentage of car that took less, so it actually got worse. It went from 67 to 65. But if you
still
look at it
isn't-
compared to the other ones,
Yes,
it
it's still among the
got a
lowest
lot
of the
better.
peers.
Is that how you're supposed to read that?
Because the higher the bar, the better, right?
Maybe I'll try to walk you through and it makes a little bit more sense. I know it's hard. Sometimes higher percentages are better and sometimes higher percentages are not as good. So let's go to the chart on the left, which one of the Transnet goals is to relieve congestion, and a key performance indicator related to that measure is commute time. So if you're looking at that chart on the left, the data shows that 65% of San Diegans spent less than 30 minutes commuting in 2015. In 2005, that was 67%. They're still better than the comparable areas, so along with Las Vegas, they're like at the lowest.
I'm confused. I thought Caitlin just straightened me out because I read it backwards. But we have fewer people spending less than 30 minutes, which means it's worse situation.
Right.
Yes,
Well, I
since
think the point of
2005, from 2005, but you still have 65% of San Diegans are traveling less than 30 minutes today. In 2005, that was 67%, so a slight decline.
Worse, slightly.
So given the
Yes.
population.
Well, you'd have to look
Yes.
at the context of population growth, and also I
Right.
think the point of looking at some of the other cities is to see, is our trend better or worse than the trends in other cities? So it's, the statistic in isolation doesn't tell the whole story, I think.
Right,
Well,
and I mean, if you're looking at Tampa or Seattle, they had a much larger
Riverside.
drop, right?
This is one of those ones that'd be nice to have a benchmark to
Absolutely.
start from. Say, if you have minimal or no decrease or increase in your commute times with population growth, with all these other factors, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It's hard to say.
Without a target.
Yeah.
So the region is across the nation. Everyone's starting finally to get some targets, because then you can put it a little bit more into context of what it means. Because maybe you knew it was probably going to get worse, but you wanted to minimize it by a certain percentage. But without that target, it really is just, here's what the data shows that has occurred over this 10-year period.
That's a good point. It doesn't incorporate increase in
Absolutely.
cars on the road, which can overwhelm.
Right.
Maybe this is good. Maybe we did really, really good.
Maybe other stuff, we spend a ton of money, and this thing says we got, as Caitlin points out, we got a little worse. But it ignores whether there's more
Right.
people out there on the road, which could overwhelm the whole thing. So I guess I sit back and I say, so what am I supposed to take away from this 10-year look back? Is this good, bad, indifferent?
I
Nice
think
chart?
it's the comparison that's helpful from my perspective, of saying, well, we're doing better than our peers, except maybe for Vegas, but,
Right.
yeah. So, still, you can't.
And it is challenging for us to help you with that as well, really without those targets and a full analysis of all the factors that can affect that, which are great, and a lot of outside of the Sandag or Caltrans or MTS's, whoever's control.
You don't have a way cleanly to say, if we didn't do the 10 years worth of project, if we didn't spend the money, what would that number be?
Right. We don't have
Because
that.
it could be 30, or something, it could be way
Right. Right. Some of the planning, and maybe you could speak to your planning models,
Yeah, I mean, I
build
think-
that in.
To do that, it would be a model number.
Yeah.
If you want
Right,
X number,
right,
you would
right.
use the information, but you pull those projects out and run it and see what average commute time. So
But don't you have the data that shows the increase in ridership over that period of time? That's one thing that you do have data on.
yeah, and so
So would it be
we get into
useful to know-
ridership.
Pardon me?
Yeah, we do get into
Yes.
Would it not be useful to know that this was the result? We spent all this money, we're 2% worse, but we're moving X percent more cars through the bottlenecks. tends to put in perspective of why are we worse with all this money? Well, let's hopefully we show we move to have a lot more people through the thing.
And then, so similarly, when we were just looking at alternate modes of transportation, which includes your biking, walking, carpooling, and transit, the data showed that for those modes, it slightly decreased between 2006 and 2015 as well. But it's similar to the other regions. If you're looking at that, most of them experience a similar decrease in use of alternate modes.
This again is a very confusing statistic. It says we spend all this money on alternative modes, and again, if I got this straight, our ridership as a percentage of total people movement decreased, didn't increase. Am I reading that on this one correctly? So as a percent, if we got fewer people utilizing all these things we spend money on, but we don't know about the absolute number. I mean, let's hope we had an absolute increase in these things. Otherwise, we really got a problem on our hands of spending this money, and fewer and fewer people are using it. But you don't see that from this data. It just shows a decrease. So my knee-jerk reaction is let's stop spending money here. We're not getting it for it. I don't think that's the case. We probably have an increase in absolute numbers, but maybe the bikers are increasing at a less rapid rate than the automobile drivers. But I don't know what the facts are. This chart doesn't. It sends the wrong message. If anything, if my gut reaction is correct, we have increased ridership. This implies that we don't.
I think there's value in these charts. I don't think you can get the whole story based on the data they have. So I do think it's valuable to still look at this, but I do.
But we must. We must have some data. If we get percents, we must have the absolute numbers. Why don't we show the absolute numbers, and did the absolute numbers increase? If we spent money and we didn't get an increase in absolute numbers, we ought to stop spending money, or we're doing something wrong. That's the, if I'm understanding the data.
Well, if I could, and this may seem like a digression, but I think it's relevant, is that I think it goes back to the problem that up front, there were no real targets set. There was no, apparently no consensus on what are the most meaningful data points to be measured. And so, you know, in effect, we're left with this data dump with a lot of debate about which statistics are the most meaningful ones, because there wasn't the foresight to say, here are the most important data points, and hopefully, and I guess my comment would be that going forward, I would hope that, you know, board, staff, everybody would recognize that it's not just about data collection and reporting, it's about decision making, and that there would be some effort to decide on key metrics and key goals, so that when the 10-year review is done the next time, it won't just be a data dump, it'll be a view as to how we did relative to specific targets.
The federal government is sort of mandating that through MAP 21 and the FAST Act, so they have very specific rules on the targets that state DOTs and MPOs have to put in place, and some of those, like safety ones, are sort of just going through the pipe right now. And so in the next couple of years, you should definitely have those targets, and then they have to be reported to the federal government. It just takes, you know, time, like I said, data analysis, data gathering analysis, and how you're going to use it for decision making.
It's like putting the pieces together. Maybe we're short-cutting, let them explain the rest of it, but it seems like if you can put the pieces together and say, you know, we had 10% population growth in the San Diego region over the 10 years, and it resulted in this much increase in trips, and we maintain a minimal difference in commute time, you know, maintain commute time or something that can just tie it together. Because that message, I mean, we all know going forward, those type of messages need to be understood, articulated and understood by the public.
Your next chart talks about the actual increase on transit, the increase in ridership, which kind of gets to the point Stuart's talking about, is 11%. positive. It's good news. What was the goal? Was that half the goal, 10 times the goal? I have no clue what the expectation was when we devote the $100 million to transit. And I don't know what one uses. A lot. It's an interesting fact. It increased 10%, but it didn't decrease. The bike shows a decrease. I think that's misleading. I don't know what you do with it.
I think some of what we'll do with it is we explore it more in the performance audit, where we go through and if we have an issue, we're going to develop it and we have specific recommendations on what then can be done to, as on a go-forward basis with some of this information. For the look back, it's what existing information there was and somewhat, what does it say? And what you can draw from that.
So are we good? So for another way of measuring congestion is the condition of highway and road infrastructure, because bumpier road can slow down traffic. So you have two charts here. One is for highways on the left, and one is for local streets and roads, pavement conditions on the right. So based on Caltrans data, pavement condition in San Diego, which is that maroon colored chart bar, has actually improved since 2005, and the conditions of the highways in the San Diego region are less distressed than the statewide average, or the District 4 or District 8. And District 4 is like Sonoma, Napa, like the North Bay area, and then District 8 is San Bernardino and Riverside counties. And District 11 for San Diego includes Imperial County as well. On the local street and road side, you can see that in 2008, San Diego's pavement condition was considered good, and it was actually the highest amongst those comparison areas. In 2016, it declined through the years, and it hit its lowest point in 2016. But as you may recall from the City of San Diego presentation from the November ITALC meeting, they have a new pavement rehab program. So what we're expecting for the next reporting period, which is 2018, that the condition for the San Diego region is actually going to go up and be in the good 70 range again.
That charts the region as a whole, not just the city of San Diego though, right?
So this is for the San Diego County, the whole
county,
including
right.
all,
Okay, so
including the county and all the local jurisdictions. Yes,
yeah,
but it's just because the city makes up, almost half of your roads. That if they're bad, then it pulls everybody down, and if they're better, then it brings everybody up. So Transnet also set out to improve safety, and safety can be measured in terms of collisions resulting in injuries and fatalities. So over the past 10 years, as shown on this slide, injuries and fatalities on San Diego highways and roadway decreased 9% for injuries and then 19% for fatalities, which is good. On the other hand, we have bike rider and pedestrian safety stats, and bike rider collisions resulting in injuries and fatalities increased 21% between 2005 and 2015. And similarly for pedestrian collisions that resulted in injuries and fatalities, they increased 18% between 2005 and 2015.
This was a very interesting chart. I found the previous one very interesting too. I certainly don't want to go to San Francisco anymore. It's an extremely dangerous place. But I assume it's not the purpose of your report, but I would think that we, as I thought, would be interested in the staff's response to the money we spent to, quote, improve pedestrian and bikeways. We've got a deterioration in safety. Obviously, there's not a direct correlation between those two activities, but there seems to be a need for some investigation of what's transpiring. Does the data jump around year to year, or is this a continuous progression over the 10 years? It's very disconcerting that we have worsening safety conditions when we have spent sizable amounts of money, in theory, to improve both of those activities.
the transportation committee, this came up as well, kind of wanting to, and really you need to dig into the actual data, both, you know, geographically, where did they occur? Are they certain intersections? Are they certain areas? Or, and kind of the nature, is it, you know, someone wasn't obeying the law or something, you know, things like that and stuff. So this is an area we know that it's yeah.
I, at least for
And this was
myself, if
disturbing.
I have a report back on what the staff investigates and concludes from.
And I'm wondering if this is the converse of the point Dick made earlier. These are absolute numbers, right? They're not like a rate.
It's a rate per 100 million.
Oh, it is a rate, sorry,
Yeah.
okay, never mind.
But
Okay.
they
But it's not a
actually-
percentage, I think it is,
But they have,
Because you would expect as you build more bike lanes, you're gonna have more bike riders, so the absolute number of injuries would go up. But if it's the rate of injury per, 100 users going up, then that's going the wrong way.
It's per 100 million VMTs or vehicle miles traveled, so it's a measure of, distance traveled.
It's a rate?
Yeah.
And you have a way of measuring the rate of pedestrian traffic?
Well, we do it against the 100 million BMT, which is a standard way to, and also it makes it, normalizes it amongst your peer areas.
Right, so the normalizing factor is the vehicle miles traveled by vehicles, and that is something that we do measure. So, yeah. But two things, it does speak to, there are more people that are trying to, bike to work or walk to work, so there are just the absolute numbers of those individuals are going up. But at the same time, we're looking at, complete streets design, where it takes into account that streets are not just used by vehicles, but they're used by automobiles.
yeah, I mean, a couple things I think to take a look at. This is safety I think is paramount, right? And so this is one where it's going in the wrong direction. What can we do to, looking forward to make sure it doesn't? I mean, one of the things, like small things were, so what does Sandag as an agency, what can they do with the Transnet dollars? And in some ways in terms of using the power of the purse, right, with the smart growth incentive grants and the active transportation grants that the call for projects has just been released. One of the requirements for the cities to compete for those grants is they each have to have complete streets policies, like complete streets policies in place, which looks at how, streets can be used for all modes and stuff, and in theory, be safer and whatnot. So I think there's little ways we're sort of chipping at that, but yeah, this is going in the right direction. And to the extent that this committee may want to recommend, or the board may want to consider, there's obviously other things we could think about in terms of how do we put things in place that could make this go the other way. In terms of the federal government and the focus with our long-range plans going forward on performance management. So safety is the first thing that's coming through in terms of performance measures. And the recommendation from our committees is to support the statewide goals, which is sort of envisions a zero goal by 2030, 2035. It's a really ambitious goals, because actually if you're seeing population absolute numbers go up generally because there's more people traveling and stuff, but at least the goals are ambitious in terms of getting these numbers down much lower.
but I think your point is that we would like to see some more information about
Analysis.
this.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a real wake-up call.
Yep, it is.
Recognizing, as Stuart says, we're hopeful there's an increase in foot and bicycle traffic. What do we do to solve it?
Right.
And also just actually on the safety measure issue, if you going back to the prior slide, with all respect, I think the automobile safety data really cries out to be viewed in the context of whatever can be portrayed to, if you will, separate out the effect of automobiles simply being made safer. Right, so, looking in isolation at a 9% decrease, I mean, one would think that some portion of that relates to automobiles being made safer, and so it's a question of what's the national trend, or is there any way that you could try to, make that more meaningful in terms of conditions specific to San Diego's roads and highways, as opposed to just the fact that, in general, automobiles are more safer.
It could also be we had the recession, so there's maybe less fewer people driving too, so that could have.
Do you guys do this by econometric modeling, or is it just, here's the data, we're putting it into a chart? Just, do you hold anything constant when you're looking at these things, or?
No, we're not doing a full-on for this particular look-back review.
Okay.
Yeah, these numbers are just the numbers we pull from Switters and whatnot, right?
Yes, this is Switter
Yeah, so
data.
basically it includes all kinds, I mean, it includes DUIs, includes a lot of,
Yeah.
it includes a number of things, so.
As
one in-
reported.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as reported.
So in addition to the congestion relief and safety goals, Transnet, as you know, is also funding a portion of MTS and NCTD transit operations, less than 13% for each operator, as well as provides full funding for rapid services along major corridor transit improvement routes. So we reviewed the performance both system-wide, which is on the left chart, and then just for rapid services, mostly using federal national transit database information, and then some results directly from MTS and NCTD. So on the left side, you'll see that generally the San Diego region performed favorably. So for transit ridership, it increased 11% between 2006 and 2016, and that is system-wide. On the right chart, you'll see seat utilization for rapid services and Superloop. And seat utilization basically measures the percent of seats occupied, or in other words, how full or empty your buses run. So generally, seat utilization has increased for the rapid routes, and there was a slight decline for Superloop over the same 2-year period.
So that chart is better and more appropriately presented in your actual book, because in bold type O, there says it's an 11% increase. The chart eyeball looks like it doubled. It's hard to read the scale, it's chartsmanship. But at least your formal report got to emphasize it's an 11%. That's what I mentioned earlier. What was our objective? Did we expect that twice that the money we spent for less than that? I have no idea. How did we do relative to expectation? It goes back to Stuart's point, because this is a major issue we all know about the controversy whether to put money in highways and transit. And here we see, well, geez, an 11% increase. Is that good news or is that bad news?
Well, with the 10% population growth, it suggests that there's not a big shift to transit, it just suggests proportional.
So the chart's raising as many questions as they answer.
So maybe the next few slides address some of that. We also looked at the quality of transit service in terms of on-time performances, measuring the percent of trips that arrived on time. So as you can see on this slide, NCTD's rail service generally met or exceeded established on-time performance guidelines, although the fixed route bus service and paratransit services struggle to consistently meet the guidelines that they have set. And then, although not shown on this slide, but in Exhibit 32 on page 49 of the report, it shows the on-time performance for MTS, which is similar to an NCTD bus service, which did also not consistently meet targeted on-time performance goals for the period that data was available between 2012 and 2015.
I'm curious if as part of this you checked to make sure that the definition of on-time didn't change across the time period that you reviewed? Because I know that's been an issue with airline on-time performance reporting, is that they actually changed the definition of what is counted as on-time.
There's a lot of that with these metrics. There is the definition even of the different types of service, whether you're a hybrid rail or commuter rail. So that is some of the challenge looking over the 10 years. Some of the definitions, as it's reported, have changed over time. We didn't look specifically at NCTDs and MTS's on-time, definitions change, but.
And then this next slide, we were also looking at the efficiency or the financial sustainability and efficiency of services provided by MTS and NCTD. So on this slide, you see when we're comparing fare box and recovery against national peers for fixed route bus and light rail, San Diego shows a much higher percentage of operating costs were covered by fare revenues than clear regions. And then similar for other metrics, with San Diego reporting higher passenger trips per revenue mile and lower operating costs than its peers as well. And those are just highlights. There's a whole Appendix C in the report, and as well as Chapter 3 of the report that provides more information on transit performance measures.
These charts are pretty impressive, San Diego's performance, but I'm curious whether there's a story behind them. Why? In other words, what's the elasticity of demand for ridership based on fares? And if these other peers are recovering less than half of what we're recovering, is that because they purposely are keeping the fares very low to try to stimulate, so they get a much bigger increase in ridership? But is there a much bigger analysis that needs to tell us whether this is a good result? It appears very impressive, but maybe it's not achieving our objective of getting ridership up and putting more dollars into operating subsidies. And I can't tell whether that's what these other cities are consciously doing, or they're just ineffective at getting the fares to be a higher percentage of the cost.
It's a whole nother study onto its own to look at that fare, but you're absolutely right. Some of them do keep that. We'll look at that a little bit more in the performance audit.
I suggest that staff might want to put that on a list. I'm sure there's a very long list of things to do, but that would be interesting to me, how we go about setting the rate structure relative to others, whether we're a method to achieve our goal and what we're doing.
Yeah, my reflection, and we are doing the fare study on behalf of the partnership with transit operators, but my recollection is our like per trip fares, if you did buy a pass, right? If you buy a monthly pass, a lot of times it's the actual fares is much less, but it's like our general like per trip fares, if you just rode the bus, are higher, are generally higher than many of our
All of whether it's a pass or fare individual ride rate structure relative to the demand compared to what others are doing. Are we in the optimal spot, or ways to improve our ridership?
So another part of the Transnet program relates to environmental mitigation that called for funding mitigation of direct environmental impacts related to Transnet capital construction projects, as well as regional conservation of habitat and endangered species. So program performance has achieved several accomplishments and successes over the past 10 years. Many acres were acquired, and most importantly, land purchased was less expensive than expected, and we're looking at a savings of about $120 million. In addition, CNDAG works closely with several entities to implement the Memorandum of Agreement for acquiring and mitigating habitats, put in place a strategic management and monitoring plan to link funding, goals, objectives, and actions, and developed an online portal to track, share, and store habitat management and monitoring data. And then in addition to all these efforts in related performance, there's millions of dollars of grant incentive funds that have been allocated and completed. And these grants benefit transit services, bike and pedestrian modes of travel, mixed-use development focused around public transit to increase housing and transportation choices. So the performance statistics and trends that we've described are impacted by how CNDAG and its Transnet partners are overseeing and delivering the program, because there's value provided to the taxpayer if a program has strong oversight and governance. So past performance audit noted that an accountable environment and tone at the top at CNDAG, with an open and collaborative relationship with Transnet partner agencies, and a robust citizen oversight committee as a safeguard to increase accountability. And in fact, as reported in past performance audits, the Transnet oversight structure is robust, and the framework in place really encourages collaborations across local jurisdictions and governmental borders, with ITOG really being more robust than many other places with similar sales tax measures. And then also related to oversight and program delivery, past audits found that Transnet project management practices follow leading practices over areas such as multidisciplinary teams, communication, project documentation, monitoring, oversight, conflict of interest, and many more. Also, from past performance audit, where we reported that CNDAC and its Transnet partners have been at the forefront of many innovative practices, some of which are unique to the region and are actually looked to by others. And I listed a couple of those there. You're aware from those from the past audits, and we're looking into just the corridor directive function. We're looking at the CMPC delivery method a little bit more. But also CNDAC has been able to have projects in a shovel ready so that when funding became available, they were ready and they were able to win this funding. There's a dashboard, the keepsandiegomoving.com. And then also the environmental mitigation program has been recognized as a successful component of Transnet. In 2012, the California chapter of the American Planning Association conferred its Best Practices Award on the EMP. So, achieving all these goals of Transnet and increasing performance on the areas that we've discussed so far really are all dependent on adequate level of funding. But with the nature of project scope modifications, cost increases, and needs that change, CNDAC and its partners are continually tasked and challenged with leveraging and balancing Transnet funds. So as part of this review, the board asked us to look at Transnet financing, and we found generally that decisions made benefited the program. But Michael will tell you a little bit more about Transnet financing.
Thank you. Transnet sales tax revenues are a key component of SANDAG's funding, and although they account for only a portion of total expenditures, the sales tax funds provide a leveraging point for other federal, state, and local dollars. Through July 2017, Transnet extension funds were leveraged with federal, state, and local funds at a 1.89 to 1 ratio. So for every $1 that was spent by SANDAG for Transnet funds, an additional $1.89 in other funding was secured. SANDAG's use of debt through the first 10 years helped advance projects, but they will be transitioning to a pay-go approach in the early 2020s. Both debt approach
Can I interrupt, right?
Sure.
Sorry. What does that mean, the pay-as-you-go versus what's being done now?
Right, so a pay-go is you're only going to spend what you take in terms of
You don't get to
transit.
finance any of it?
There are a few other financing options they will have, but for the most part, they're going to move away from the use of bonding.
Why?
Because we've reached our
Protect
capacity.
capacity.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I can continue this interruption, this is an area where I think it would be very useful if there was some additional dialogue of the fact. You make the statement, we're going to pay as you go, and the explanation was sound, but there's nothing I'm going to overstate the point, to make my point, is there's nothing left to pay. It's all gone. It's all gone to debt service. In the extreme, I'm exaggerating because we don't know it. You're making forecasts for next year, but the vast majority of the projected monies to be received for the major projects is gone. It's gone to debt service. There will be no more money for major projects. So the concept is pay as you go is a little disingenuous because there's nothing left to pay.
So right now, just to give a little bit of context, major corridors took in, I think, about $104 million in this last year. Debt service will rise to about $100 million over the next few years. So right now, that would be, the difference is small. The rationale, of course, is that the amount that you're taking in through Transnet is going to continue to rise if for no other reason than inflation. And then on top of that, there's the component of additional sales tax collections from changes in behavior. So right now, you're kind of in this inflection point where there's not a huge gap between them. But over the next few years, and just to kind of give you a little more context, there's some additional funding sources that SANDAG has secured for the next small period of time, right? There's the TIFIA loan and stuff for Mid-Coast that's coming up to provide cash flow in the interim. So as they get to that 2020, mid-2020 point to transition to pay-go, it's really that difference as it grows is going to be the first seed money that'll start to spend down once they make that transition.
It would be useful, and I know this is all projections, and one thing we know about projections, it will never be right, but we can get a range. We know the debt service with the additional loans, we hit our maximum capacity.
Right.
What percentage of the projected future tax revenues for those purposes will be devoted to the debt service? And what's left over for pay-as-you-go?
Sure.
Very useful to put in perspective.
And I hate to just kick things forward to the audit, but that is something that will be part of the audit, is kind of a sensitivity analysis of that risk in light of some of those concerns.
And then it also has to be looked at in the context of what additional projects need to be funded, because if, you know, again, to your point, like sort of in the extreme, if you've completed 100% of the projects and all you need to do is pay down the debt, then, okay, pay-go is, it's kind of like, who cares, because you've completed the project. So that's the other part of the equation, is how much will be left not yet completed by the time you get to pay-go.
And that raises a very interesting question that I've slowly internalized, is what was the intent of the original ordinance? Is to build X, Y, Z, period, or was it to have an amount of money coming in every year from then current taxpayers to enhance their commute? And the answers have to be, well, it's the former, not the latter, because there won't be any money for my grandkids to enhance their commute with driverless cars and everything, because will all have been spent for the programs that we're committed to up front. And if that's all the ordinance was to do, and then we were going to take 40 years to do it, and the 31st year taxpayer don't really get anything other than to get in line for congested freeways that we built 20 years ago, then we've achieved the objective. And I'm gathering the ordinance was really just to commit to a certain number of projects, not to have a source of funds from each year's taxpayers to enhance their commute. I don't know that. I'm making that assumption because that's certainly the path we're on.
Right, so I think it was actually both. I mean, if you look at the objectives, you know, as, you know, Schoberg outlined at the beginning, you know, there were a number of goals, kind of overarching goals of the ordinance: congestion relief, safety, and providing alternative modes of transportation. Those were the overarching goals. How to do that was to implement, you know, a certain listing of projects, right? Transit, highway, you know, bikeway projects. So I think it's both. You know, it's the goals and then how to achieve it through a specific set.
And we also listed not types of projects, we listed specific projects.
Specific projects.
The ordinance listed specific
That's
projects,
correct.
sort of promised we'd do all these things.
Right.
We justified borrowing the monies and we could do all these things, we promised to get them done sooner.
Right.
But at the expense of having any money left over to do stuff in the future.
Well, I mean, if you look at the specific listing of projects, you know, that the goal of achieving the improved congestion relief, for example, was to complete those projects. Let's say that at, you know, year 30, the ordinance has completed all of the projects. The board could modify the listing of projects and add more projects. I mean, that's an option. Let's say the technology changes and then the overarching goals of improving congestion may no longer be met by completing certain projects. Then the board has the option, has the flexibility of amending the project listing. So it's, you know, it's how to achieve the goal. Back then, the idea was you need to complete all of these projects.
The list that was put forth to be achieved, all these major projects, isn't our current plan to have effectively all those achieved by 2030?
No, through 2048.
It's really going to take that long to get all those done? The acceleration that we've been finished before.
We would all like to be finished earlier. We would all like to be finished earlier,
Well,
but.
I thought the intention was by
Right, I mean,
borrowing,
it's, and that's what we do, sort of, you know, these annual plans of finance where we compare, okay, this is how much the current cost estimates are. This is what we think we're going to be getting, not just right now, but over time. And so you compare costs versus revenues and figure out, okay, this is how long it's going to take.
Didn't we have a slide, I think from Andre or someone, and we had talked about it a little bit, that was a bar chart that showed debt service against revenues, and having, I thought, what seemed like a healthy cushion, and you had a debt coverage ratio that was pretty high. So how does that play into the not having any money left to do any more programs?
Debt service is 100% of revenue, where the expenditures are only, what is it, 30-some-odd% for major projects. So they're two different things.
So essentially what Andre was showing was the coverage ratio based on 100% of the revenues. Because that's what bondholders essentially look at. At the same time, we look at the ability of the sub-programs to handle the capacity, or to handle the debt that is incurred to advance the projects within those individual programs. So we also look at, can these individual programs sustain debt service over time for the debt that we're getting? So in the case of major corridors, as I think Michael was alluding to, it's like around 2020, or very close to where we are right now, the amount of money coming in for that individual element for major corridors is going to be about the same as what is for debt service, right? But as you look into the future, debt service will be for the most part fixed.
Right.
But revenues, assuming that inflation and whatnot continue, those would rise over time. So that delta of revenues versus debt service, the access will grow over time as well.
Do you guys have the ability, if it didn't, for instance, to pull from other parts of the program to pay debt service if that goes below?
So the way the bonds are worded, as we understand them, yeah, they have the option to take all Transnet revenues minus the BOE fees for administration. So it could potentially impact the ability or the allocation of funds to other programs, if that were the case. Any other questions on that point? I'm going to continue. Sandag's use of debt generally aligns with peers, allowed for the acceleration of EAP projects, and likely helps Sandag take advantage of unexpected federal and state funding streams. Looking at revenue projections over the past 8 years available, results showed that actual collections were fairly consistent with the initial ordinance forecast placed before voters. Using data provided by Sandag, we compared actual sales tax revenues with ordinance forecasts in nominal dollars, that is, year of collection dollars. Results showed that the percent difference was only 0.6%, with actual collections being more than ordinance expectations over the first 8 years of collections. However, the difference between predicted and actual collections grows over time, as you can see here. Actual collections were greater than forecasted in 2009, again in nominal dollars, but by 2016, actual collections were more than 5% lower than forecasted, which leads us into the picture that I think we're all familiar with. While the past decade performance was generally consistent with the ordinance forecast, the most recent revenue forecasts show that collections are on track to bring in significantly less. We provide two reviews of this forecast in the report, one in nominal dollars and the other in real 2002 dollars. The 2016 consensus forecast suggests that Transnet will collect $19 billion in nominal dollars, or about $8.9 billion in real 2002 dollars. These figures represent about a $20 billion decline in nominal dollars and a $5 billion decline in real dollars from the initial forecast. It is important to note here that the forecasts reflect very different assumptions, with the initial forecast reflecting now outdated assumptions of higher population, higher income growth, and higher inflation rates. As an additional note, these forecasts shown here were not affected by the forecasting error. As confirmed by the investigation, the forecasting errors were not present in either the initial ordinance forecast or the recent 2016 consensus forecast. In this regard, Sandag's experience was not unlike other agencies who had similar measures in place. We compared Sandag's forecast to other agencies with similar voter-approved half-cent sales tax measures that were enacted or renewed between 2002 and 2008. And those agencies had also made initial revenue forecasts and have subsequently updated those forecasts. For instance, if we look here, for agencies that have a 20-year measure, Sandag's decreases, were 18.4% over the first 20 years, compared to 32 and 39.9% for similar agencies. When we look at the 30-year measures, so Sandag over 30 years compared to OCTA, which has a 30-year measure, Sandag's reduction was 36.6% compared to 41.6% for OCTA. But over the entire life of the plan, the difference between the two forecasts, again in nominal dollars, is 50.8%.
Isn't that just indicative the further out you go, when you have a negative variance, it's a compounding, it's going to get progressively worse?
Exactly.
Looks terrible to us to be at the bottom line with a minus 50%.
Right.
Right.
but when you, and again, it's because a big part of it is Sandag is unique in having such a good measure, whereas nearly every other agency we looked at is either 20 or 30 years.
I think your written report does a very good job of trying to put this forecasting error in perspective with this, because I've always said the water my tail on the dog, and I think you did a good job trying to get people to focus on that.
On the cost side, it is challenging to estimate costs when the initial Transnet cost estimates were made before all project scopes were really defined. Prior to the start of the extension, though, Sandag did make a number of assumptions about project costs over time. Those initial assumptions have actually largely been consistent with actual cost increases since the start of the ordinance. At the same time, though, recent trends show that construction costs have increased at a faster rate than Transnet revenues, which is what's shown in this graph here. Since 2005, as captured by the Caltrans and the Engineering News Record indices, construction costs have grown at a faster rate than Transnet revenues, which creates an additional funding need. Given Sandag's historic revenue generation, current project and fund management practices, and expected future revenues, it is reasonable to expect that the Transnet program could be delivered in the 4-year time frame. However, Sandag will need to be vigilant to ensure that it has the capacity to complete Transnet, given the following factors: the uncertainty of long-range, uncertainty of long-range forecasts. I think we actually had changed this to uncertainty of long-term revenues. Sorry, that threw me off. Rising construction costs, and then, of course, the challenges of transitioning to a pay-go approach, as we've sort of discussed. As a result of these factors and the inherent uncertainty associated with planning on a 40-year time frame, Sandag may need to consider future revisions to project scopes or delaying projects beyond the 40-year horizon. Before we discuss items for future consideration, we would like to share Appendix B with you, which begins on page 94 of the report. Appendix B is a Transnet project status listing which the board requested and we prepared as part of our review.
So while the concept of a Transnet project listing seems straightforward, there are several challenges that make a simple presentation complicated. For example, it's important to remember that the ordinance identified improvements along 15 major corridors, as well as spelled out 48 major corridor projects. But once projects get planned, designed, and built, there will be many more project segments that than were initially shown in the ordinance. So, for example, at the time of our review, the 48 ordinance projects evolved into 78 capital improvement program segments. And as you will hear later from Caltrans, they are now asking you to review splitting one CIP projects into 2 projects. So as we're moving along, that number of 78 project changes. And I'm sure if you're pulling up the dashboard today, it's no longer 78 projects anyways. So, and what didn't make this exercise easy either was there was no mechanism put in place to track the ordinance projects through the years. So we're not only looking at possible project name changes, but also project limit changes, or like the Coronado Tunnel that's no longer being done either. And so there's many moving parts that we tried to weave together for this Transnet project listing. To facilitate going through that listing, we created a cheat sheet that it starts on page 94 of the report and hopefully explains what everything means. So, for example, if you're interested in the I-15 express lane south segments, the listing will show you how it rolls up to the SR 63 to SR 56 major corridor ordinance project, and that ultimately rolls up to the I-15 corridor. There are some other crosswalks that were not as easy because sometimes you have a project segment that benefits multiple corridors. So for the I-15, you have the fast track that crosses all the north, the middle, and the south segment, but ultimately all rolls up to the I-15 corridor. So pulling all of that information together on the next slide, in a nutshell, you'll have the 48 major corridor projects in terms of the status. So when the voters approved the extension ordinance, they set out to build 48 major corridors, and as of last year, 61% of those 48 major corridor projects are either complete or in progress, and 39% are still future projects. When in 2002 dollars, the ordinance estimated those projects to cost $9.6 billion in 2002 dollars, and then as of July 2017, about $4.4 billion has been expended. And CNDAG, in its current plan of finance, estimates that it's going to be another about $22.7 billion to complete all of those projects that were set out in the ordinance. So it is important to realize that comparing these budgets and expenditures side by side is not a true apples-to-apples comparison due to several challenges. Mainly because it takes time to complete these large projects, and what you thought it would cost in 2002 may no longer be applicable in 2005 or when you're ready to start construction. So on the expenditure side, it's challenging to line up costs which are tracked at a segment level, but the ordinance had them show the budgets at the major corridor, 48 major corridor project level or the 15 corridor level. And then you still have so many unplanned projects that will be developed along those corridors over the remaining 30 years of the program. And so estimating costs or the amount left to complete those projects is challenging without having a defined scope. So taking all of these factors into consideration, we try to crosswalk the segments to the ordinance. We escalated budgets to year open and used the 2017 plan of finance to provide remaining costs to complete estimates for the ordinance projects. So here's what we got. This is just the first few rows of the Transnet project listing and status. For each segment that is completed, we're showing an open to traffic date, as well as calculated the variance between the budget and the expenses through the year open. So for example, on the I-15 Express Lanes South segment, it was budgeted at $332 million and was completed for $330 million. To provide that more apples-to-apples comparisons of budgets and expenditures, we escalated the 2005 budget to the 2011 year that it was open. So that is now $380 million, and with $330 million spent, the budget, the project came under budget of about $50 million. So this kind of information you will find for all of the 78 project segments that were in place at the time we were pulling this data. But as I said, there's probably many more projects. If you have any more questions about the Appendix B, we'll be happy to answer those at the end of the presentation maybe, because we want to go into the next and last slide, which are really our look forward considerations that we were asked to look at as part of the 10-year look back review. So really, while there's no one solution or a correct combination of strategies, projects, or programs for addressing a region's needs, and while data has shown that much has been accomplished over the past 10 years of the 40-year Transnet program, there have been themes for consideration and deliberation. For some of these areas, more analysis and possible recommendations will be conducted as part of the triennial performance audit, which will be presented to ITOC and SANDA committees later this spring and summer. That said, we identified 6 areas for consideration. The first 2 related to the Local Streets and Roads program for strengthening reporting to SANDAG and project accomplishments and performance, as well as a revisited definition between congestion relief and maintenance projects, so that 30-70 split. And then, in addition, we recommend another consideration of additional allocations for enhanced performance tracking, analysis, and reporting at the regional level, in particular with local street and roads and the EMP portal data. And then also with new federal MAP 21 and FAST Act requirements, additional resources may be needed to better measure performance and return on taxpayer investment. The fourth consideration relates to investments in ITS technologies, because future regional needs may dictate a heavier emphasis on expanded use of this technology, rather than your traditional capacity building construction project. This goes in concert with another consideration to continually evaluate the mix of future projects to achieve congestion relief or other Transnet goals. For instance, with all the technology changes in recent years, different projects may be needed to accommodate autonomous vehicles or retrofit existing infrastructure to support charging stations for electric vehicles. And then our final consideration relates to the EMP Local Mitigation Bank. While significant progress has been made to acquire lands to mitigate regional projects, the bank set aside for mitigation costs for local projects was significantly underutilized. Only about $13 million of the $200 million was spent. So the board may want to repurpose the use of these funds for other areas within the EMP. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for your attention. If there's any more questions, we're happy to answer them if there's time.
I've got one question. It goes back to your commentary about governance, which strikes me as being something of a subjective sort of thing. And I'm wondering if you could perhaps elaborate on the manner in which you assessed governance.
That was done as part of past audits, so looking at some of the existing data with those past audits showed.
Okay, so you weren't making an assessment yourself, you were just...
Not on this tenure, but however, we happen to do those past audits as well. And some of that is we looked at the structure in place, we looked at the controls, the tone at the top at SandAg, the relationships with the various Transnet partners, MOU agreements that they had in place and what they covered, conflict resolution, how they met. We poured through on past audits, board minute meetings, and looked at the deliberations that went on, what type of information was being brought before your committee, all the other committees in the board, and what types of questions they would ask, and how involved they were on those things. And at the time, compared them to some of the other areas where we had some of that same detail too. Again, not this part of this tenure review, but it was reported on the past audits.
Gotcha, okay. So again, you are not making your own assessment here, you're just really reviewing prior assessments?
Yes.
Gotcha, okay.
Just to, since it was right in front of us and somewhat glaring, the I-15 Express Lane's middle segment, the variance of $385 million.
There's kind of a caveat to that. So the way project expenditures are tracked doesn't necessarily separate the initial Transnet with the extension ordinance. So only a portion, I think $75 million of the extension was supposed to go to the middle segment. The reported budget number there shows the entire project. And so that's why I think it really highlights the difficulty of providing a simple project table because you can't separate those two elements from each other.
But since there's 3 segments shown, why would you not just take the total and subtract the other 2? Or maybe I'm not following you.
Sorry, the middle segment specifically had money committed to it and I think was under construction before the ordinance was extended.
Okay.
So in the extension, in the ordinance, it said we're going to fund this, but only $75 million to complete it. So all the rest of the expenditures minus $75 million had already been spent.
Okay.
But we can't separate, the way the reporting system works, we can't separate out what was spent before and what was spent after. We only see what the total was.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments?
Big task. Thank you, guys.
Comprehensive report here is that tells a lot of stories, but also raises some questions that you need to figure out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
We're behind. Check in with our if we need to rearrange things or take things out of order.
I think the next item is something that is time sensitive, so, and I'm told folks can get it done in about 10 minutes, the presentation piece of it, and I think we could probably do the same for the performance measures item. So we may be able to get through all of them, but the last item is something that we could potentially push to the February agenda if necessary.
So this is item 7, correct?
Yes.
Good morning.
When did you take that picture? No cars in that one. I want to drive that.
The one before? The beauty of doing simulation. Good morning. This is a continuing item of just updating folks and making some administrative and financial adjustments as it relates to this portfolio of projects that we're doing in the Golden Triangle in relationship to UCSD, Midcoast, and some freeway improvements. And this basically is an exhibit we've been using over the years. Starting in 2015, Sandag, Caltrans, and University entered into an agreement to build all of these projects in a collaborative manner, in an integrated manner, to avoid rework, to avoid impacts to the university, and to do it most efficiently. And basically what you see on this exhibit is the red line is the LRT, the Midcoast project. The blue improvements are the Genesee expansion that you see out there today. The green is the Voight project, some arterial work that tries to integrate the LRT into the campus and builds a station there. And then there's an auxiliary lane on I-5 that's southbound between Genesee and La Jolla Village. So, back in 2015, it's like, how can we build this all together and, as I said, minimize, throw away, and do it most efficiently? Last year, we took an item to you and the board to integrate the Voight project and the auxiliary lane project with the CMGC contractor, MCTC, out there. So all this is, with the exception of the Genesee project in the blue, all of this is getting built by one contractor, making things go much easier. Just wanted to, if you haven't been out there, I wanted to just kind of give you a couple photos of what it looks like. This is basically standing almost next to 5, looking east. To the left is the Voight arterial, and you see the columns coming up in their relationship to the Voight arterial. You can understand why we would want to do the widening of the arterial and the LRT with one contractor in an integrated manner. You can see how close they are. Everybody's been watching the Gilman Bridge, which is a UCSD element to connect the campuses. That's its basic need and purpose, is to connect the campuses. We've been getting lots of great questions about how freeway traffic gets up there and all sorts of things, but it's just a connection east-west. Been on the books for years, important part of the university infrastructure. And then Genesee, that project's been moving along quickly. This is probably a 3-month-old bridge or photo. The good news is the new structure is now open to traffic, and so basically we've expanded that bridge. It used to be a 4-lane bridge, and I think we're up to 10 lanes now with the left turn pockets. The last item of work is on the west end, west side. We're building a new bike pedestrian bridge that crosses Genesee and will link the transit station in Sorrento Valley with the university and the hospital. All of that's going well. The Genesee project should have a ribbon cutting in late spring of this year. We're looking at the May timeframe. So basically, what's next? What's the next step? The auxiliary lane that we're planning to build on I-5 is a state Caltrans funded project out of the shop. As I said, we are integrating it into the CMGC contract. We're waiting for the CMGC contractor to finish the transit line as it crosses the freeway, so that we can drop that false work, and then the aux lane goes right under the new bridge that MCTC will be constructing. So that's one element. Second element that we wanted to talk about today was the Voight arterial work. Originally, when we had brought that to you in the past, we've talked about sort of 2 components. That's the arterial improvements, the widening, and then we were going to remove and replace the old bridge there that crosses I-5, and the idea there was to basically do it as part of the project and set up the future expansion of the I-5, and there was going to be a direct access ramp there, and there still is. Over the last year, I think when we looked at the revenue projections, we realized that I-5 widening HOV project's probably slipping away a little bit in time. It's taking a little bit longer to get the funds to build that. So, you know, also the price for the bridge replacement was increasing. So we really asked ourselves, is now the right time to do it? Or can we just defer and build it as part of the future I-5 expansion? So we've been working with the university, working with the LRT, and the decision was made, we can defer it and we will build it at a later time. And so that saves some money now. And so one of the items today, we just wanted, you know, noticing folks that the scope of the project is changing. And we're basically going to build it in 2 phases. So all that we're going to build now is the arterial improvements, and we're going to integrate that with the LRT, and then the Dar Bridge replacement will get pushed to a later time. At the same time, as we've done as part of the collaborative process, the university has asked us to add 3 or 4 university enhancements to the project that they're going to bring money to the table, and they're funding the design and they're funding the construction. And basically those are the 3 things you see on the right-hand side of the slide. Since we're not going to remove and replace the Voigt-Dar Bridge, they would like to improve the sidewalk over that bridge to just make it easier for peds to get across from the east campus to the west campus. We're working with them, and they're going to fund that. They have a number of utility enhancements that they'd like to put in the arterial. That Voigt arterial, although it looks just like a city street, it really is almost like a utility freeway with all the ITS improvements they need for their hospitals and campus. And then the third thing is they're doing a number of residential improvements on the east side, and they're actually going to improve that intersection there at Genesee and Voigt, and so they're going to fund that improvement as well. So the item that we have today really does 3 things. It splits the state-funded auxiliary lane out of the larger project just from a financial tracking perspective. The state is bringing another almost $300,000 to the table to finish the design of that auxiliary lane. We're removing the Voigt Bridge from the description, and then the third thing is we're adding the design money that the university is bringing to the table to finish their enhancements. The region is also funding an additional $500,000 to complete the design of the Voigt arterial. That'll bring it up to shovel ready. In this year's upcoming CIP process, then we will bring the construction dollars needed to build that arterial, but that'll be done as a separate item later this year. So those are the 3 things we're doing today. And with that, any questions? Any questions?
Just for clarification, the terminology, you said several times we're delaying the Voigt Bridge reconstruction.
Yes.
The new bridge is continuing. The Gilman is the new bridge.
Yes.
That's continuing. The existing bridge isn't going to be expanded, retrofitted for a while.
Exactly.
But there will be 2 bridges soon.
Yes, there will actually be 3 bridges, because you're going to see the Gilman Arch that you see out there constructing today. You're going to see a brand new LRT bridge that's going to be constructed right next to the existing Voigt Bridge, and so you'll see those 3 bridges.
For vehicles, you will have 2 bridges. One enhancement will be deferred.
Yes.
So the Voigt Bridge, is the northern widening or something that's not gonna have, that's what you prefer, or is it both sides?
The Voigt Bridge will actually get removed and replaced.
Okay.
Ultimately, the columns are too close, and we can't get additional freeway lanes through without replacing it.
Oh, related to the five features, okay.
Yeah.
Moved and replaced.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Item 8, San Diego Forward Regional Plan for Performance Measures.
Good morning.
Good morning.
One of the main efforts in the development of the regional plan is the creation of different transportation network scenarios. And the performance measures that I'm going to speak about are one tool that the board can use in deciding which transportation scenario to include in the final regional plan. Based on the provisions of the Transnet Extension Ordinance, the ITAC is responsible for participating in the ongoing refinement of the San Diego Transportation System performance measurement process used in development of the regional transportation plan. And as you are probably aware, our regional transportation plan was merged with our regional comprehensive plan back in 2015 to create a new regional plan document, which we're currently working to update for adoption in 2019. This slide here shows the schedule for the development of the 2019 regional plan. The Sandag Board of Directors approved the vision and goals of April 2017, which we'll see on the next slide. And the regional plan includes an unconstrained network of transit, roadway, active transportation, goods movement projects, and operations projects. And this list was approved by the board in October 2017. The network is called unconstrained because it reflects the needs of the region and is not constrained by anticipated funding. Sandag staff are currently working to develop project cost estimates as well as revenue forecasts for the year 2050. And once we have the range of estimated costs and how much the region will be able to afford to spend based on the revenue forecasts, we'll develop transportation network scenarios that include different combinations of transit projects, highway projects, bike, walking, and technology projects. The scenarios or network options will be compared and contrasted using a set of performance measures that evaluate the performance of the transportation system or network as a whole. And we're here to get your input today on these different performance measures, and I'll be outlining those specific metrics in the presentation. When the measures are applied, the board will consider the performance of the different networks and ultimately select one transportation network scenario to be included in the final plan and its environmental document. So this slide here shows the updated vision and goals for the regional plan. The performance measures support the plan's goals and are organized into 3 goal areas of innovative mobility and planning, healthy environment and communities, and vibrant economy. In the spring and summer of 2018, staff will be working with stakeholders, working groups, the policy advisory committees, and the board to develop a number of transportation network scenarios, which will contain the different combinations of various projects that fit within the region's budget. The transportation network performance measures are metrics that Sandag can project to show how these different combinations of projects will help people get to work and school, help the air quality in the region, help to maintain our current transportation system, and improve safety. And the performance measures are projected for future years of the plan, looking out to 2025, 2035, and 2050, and they rely on data from Sandag's travel demand model and GIS mapping to come up with the results for the different performance measures. So they're not metrics that are looking so much at what's currently on the road today, but looking forward, if we build these different sets of projects, how will travel times be affected? How will air quality be impacted? And then also we look at what happens in those future years if we don't build any more projects. So we compare that as well. So Sandag has used performance measures to help analyze the transportation network scenarios. We used them in our last 2015 regional plan, and we've used them in a number of transportation plans before that. So it's not something new to us, but every time we do an update to the plan, we update the performance measures as well. Attachment 3 of your staff report contains the performance measures for the 2015 regional plan with some proposed updates. The initial proposed updates include changes that were made to create consistency with new federal performance management metrics, and some reflect some initial input that we received from some of our policy advisory committee members in the areas of system preservation and vehicle miles traveled. The data from the performance measures is then summarized and used to answer 10 key questions. So the performance measures, we have more than 20 of them, and that produces a lot of data that we look at. So with the last regional plan that we had, staff worked with the stakeholders and got input from our policy advisory committees and the board to come up with 10 key questions that help to summarize all those data points into a more understandable format. So today I'm going to go through a few different slides that show the 10 key questions, the different performance measurements that support them, and I'm looking for input that you may have on, are we asking the right questions? Are we looking at the right types of data? Are there things that seem to be missing? Does something seem duplicative? So, and these are all draft. We're getting input from all of our different working groups and stakeholders, and we're going to be making some more
updates and changes to these metrics before we share them with our other policy advisory committee members. So under our first goal area of innovative mobility and planning, we have 4 key questions. The first looks at our travel times reduced, and this focuses on travel time to work and metrics of looking at delay. Our second question is, are more people walking, biking, using transit, and sharing rides? And this basically looks at the mode share or the breakdown of how people are traveling to get to work, and then for all different types of trips.
Excuse me. So
And then for all different.
on this one, going back to the point that Dick made previously, I would hope that you're looking both at the absolute numbers as well as sort of share.
Yeah.
Right, between modes, because I think, just as population increases, the odds are you may get more people walking, but part of, I think what you want to be tracking is the degree to which the total share of, whether it be commuters, what have you, is shifting between modes. Is that part of the?
Yeah, so that's a comment that we heard through some of our other outreach efforts, that people are interested in both the raw number of the trips for the different modes and then also with the portion or the percentage. So that's something that we're looking to add.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks.
The third question looks at, is the transportation system safer? And this looks at the number and rate of fatalities and serious injuries, and also fatalities and serious injuries for non-motorized, the people who are walking and biking. So it's total and then also for that specific population. And that correlates with some new metrics that we have that have come down through the federal management process that we have to look at. Our fourth question, proposed question, looks at, is the current transportation system being maintained adequately? And this one is supported by a metric that looks at the percent of transportation investments towards maintenance and rehabilitation.
On the attachment, it said that that's a new question. I'm curious what question was taken away with the addition of this one. Do you see that?
Off the top of my head, I think we added this one, but that's something I can go back and verify.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I think you probably had it at 10 before as well, so I'm wondering what was not considered valuable anymore. Okay. Thank you.
Under the vibrant economy, we have 2 questions here. Do the transportation investments help to improve the regional economy? And this one has a couple of different metrics that support it. One is a very comprehensive benefit cost analysis that folks in our economics department do, where they take a look at a number of different factors and monetize them. So this is elements such as travel time savings, air quality benefits, fuel consumption, and a number of different metrics. They assign a dollar value to that, as well as the value to the construction jobs created by building out the transportation network. And then that's related to the overall cost of the network. So for each dollar spent, how much benefit are you receiving back? So that's one of the metrics, which is a large metric, as it contains a number of different data elements that helps to support this question. And then this also contains metrics that look at the reliability for truck and person travel. So if you expect your trip would take half an hour to drive from point A to point B, and on a regular basis, sometimes it's 45 minutes, sometimes it's 50 minutes, sometimes it's 20 minutes. And that makes it challenging for people to plan their day. So this has 2 metrics that look at reliability for trucks and then reliability for people. And that relates to some of the new federal performance management metrics that we have to look at. Question number 6 looks at, are the relative costs of transportation changing similarly for all communities? So this looks at the costs of transportation that people are spending as far as gas, tolls, transit fares, and then takes a look at how that's changing. We do a comprehensive social equity analysis, Title VI analysis, which is required as part of the plan. So some of these metrics we break out not only for the whole regional population, but also for our disadvantaged communities, seniors, low-income populations, and minority populations, and take a look at how not only is the total population seeing their expenditures change, but how are these different groups seeing their expenditures change? And is it changing in a similar manner for all the different groups? So there's not one group, that, for example, seniors aren't seeing their costs go up by 50%, while the rest of the groups are seeing it change by 3%, for example. So this is trying to see how things are changing for everybody in the area of cost. And then our third goal area is healthy environment and communities, and here we have 4 questions. The first being, does the transportation system support smart growth? This one looks at the percentage of people and jobs that are near the transit and bike infrastructure, the distance that people are traveling to work, and also physical activity. So with how much time are people spending biking and walking, and the physical activity that they have received for that effort. Question number 8 looks at, is access to jobs and key destinations improving for all communities? And this looks at access to jobs in school, shopping, parks and beaches, as well as medical facilities.
And is that measurement keyed to transit options only, or is it a function of, like your question 8A here, percent of population within 30 minutes of jobs in higher education? Again, is that looking at transit options, or is that assuming that you have a car? And then the question is, if it includes having a car, a whole lot of lower income people might not be able to afford having a car, and so is it relevant to include having a car as part of the equation? Do you know what I mean?
Right, so we break it out by 2 modes, either by driving or by taking transit. So we look at that, what is the percent of the population that within 30 minutes can get to jobs and higher education by car? What percentage of the population, if they're using transit, can get to the same location within that same parameter of time? So obviously, if you're driving, you probably have a larger percentage of those destinations, or a larger percent of the population can get to those destinations within the time frame. So we do look at it with those 2 separate transportation options.
Okay. And a more general question, for all of these 2015 regional plan performance measures, do we actually have the ability to collect all of the data points for all of those questions currently?
So we use our transportation demand model, and that is able to create the data we need for all the different metrics.
Okay, cool.
Also under question 8, we look at average travel times to and from tribal lands, to and from adjacent counties, such as Orange County, Riverside, and Imperial counties. Our military bases and installations, what are the travel times to and from those areas, and then also to and from our borders with Mexico. Under question 9, this one looks at, is the region's air quality improving? And this is looking at smog-forming pollutants. The San Diego region is a non-attainment area for the federal ozone air quality standards. So that looks at sort of your smog-forming pollutants. Is that improving over the life of the plan or not? And then question number 10 looks at our greenhouse gas emissions reduced. And this has 2 different metrics that corresponds with it. One that looks at the on-road CO2 emissions, and then a second one that we're proposing to add based on some feedback that we've heard from some of our policy advisory committee members looking at vehicle miles.
Sorry, on number 9, the air quality, it says here the region. Is that looked at purely across the region, or is it looked at on a community by community basis as well? Because there might be significant variation between communities.
It's looked at on a region-wide basis, number 9. And when we do our, we use a software program called MFAC, which the California Air Resources Board produces, and that produces region-wide estimates of the various pollutants. It doesn't do them for smaller geographies. So it is a region-wide look at this smog-forming pollutants.
So if, for example, so air quality in National City might be getting dramatically worse, but if other parts of the region are getting meaningfully better, you might not in that measurement see that, National City is getting worse.
Yeah, the measure itself doesn't include localized hotspot analysis, for example. And if the city's report themselves.
I'm sorry?
I wonder if the cities perform that themselves.
They do for various development projects.
Yeah.
And Caitlin, back to the question that you asked earlier, which one was dropped? We had a separate question, are connections to neighboring counties in Mexico, tribal lands, and military bases improved? And we basically combined that with another measure.
With the travel time one?
Yeah,
Okay.
so that got combined. But we didn't drop the actual measurements.
Thank you.
So in November and December, we sought feedback from the various San Diego working groups. I've given a similar presentation to our public works directors and our planning directors, members of our active transportation community and our traffic engineers, and received some input from them. We held a public workshop on December 4th and had more than 100 people participate in that. We also launched an online survey in that same December timeframe and received more than 300 responses. So staff is working to compile all the different comments, and we're going to be considering them when making some additional updates to the performance measures and the key questions. Later this month, we're having an outside peer review panel, so we have some professionals who have expertise in performance measurement and modeling, who are going to be reviewing all the comments that we've received, as well as the initial proposed metrics we have, and providing us with some feedback about additional changes that we can make to better address some of the comments that we've received and take advantage of our modeling tools that we have. And then early this year, we're going to be taking a revised set of draft performance measures to the policy advisory committees. We're currently scheduled to share a discussion item at the February 2nd meeting with the regional planning committee and the transportation committee to share this update with them and also receive any additional feedback they may have. And we're looking hopefully to have the final measures approved by the board in spring of this year. And then these measures will be used in the spring and summer as the different transportation network scenarios are developed to go through and look at their performance and serve as one of the tools that our board will have to take into consideration as they select their preferred network. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take any additional questions or comments or feedback that you may have.
Is there also a public communication strategy surrounding this, so that whether there's a dashboard on the website or something of that nature? Because I think in addition to informing the board and staff about decision making, I think a lot of this information would be very interesting for the public to be able to access as well.
Yeah, with our last plan, we did come up with a piece that went along with it that kind of summarized. We sort of had thumbs up and thumbs down and looked at the different metrics. It highlighted some of the different performance measures where we saw greater changes or greater differences between our networks, and showed the answers to the key questions. Is this, is it improving? For some of the questions it was yes, this plan is improving it. For some things it was more staying stable. But we're also looking at other ways that we can graphically share the information, and we'll definitely take your comment into consideration as how to best share this and represent it to the public as a whole.
Yeah, because I would think like a website dashboard for this type of information would be really helpful for people.
Thank you.
One question on the SAC performance measures.
A couple comments on the page 4 in the report where it says your plan policy objectives. Number 19, I'm not certain that some of these are protect and restore our regions from payments. It seems like an all-encompassing commitment. It's just able to help protect and restore. Something I ought to consider when those appropriate. But more importantly, on your proposed objectives metrics, the one on is the current number 4, I guess, is the current transportation system being maintained adequately, and your metric is the percentage of transportation investments towards maintenance. That's an input measurement in my mind, not an output measurement. And the goal is not to maximize how much money we're spending. So I'm not certain whether that's a meaningful measurement. I think that there's something to measure the outputs and results, uptime, facilities, and so on. There's how much money.
Yeah, that's one that we've received some comments on, so we're going to be looking at what other options we may have for that. Thank you.
Oh, remind me, it is a goofy little thing, but how long have we been calling the RCP the San Diego Forward? How long have we been using that San Diego Forward?
So,
Does it go way back?
San Diego Forward, the regional plan, was first used in 2015 with our last regional plan.
Okay.
So our different plans, our previous regional transportation plans had a variety of different names.
The reason I asked, it ties back to the 10-year look-back thing that, because it talks about key performance goals, and it lists Transnet Goals on the second page, and it says San Diego Forward Goals. We might want to just reference, if that's a new thing, like 2015, and then this is looking back 10 years, maybe just or put in parentheses the regional plan or something, because it doesn't.
Which page was that again?
7.
Okay.
The report has a background section or introduction that does explain that it used to be that, but that's a good suggestion.
Okay, it's a ticky-tack thing, but it is. Okay.
Just on the FAST Act, I'm assuming there's no requirement that there's a FAST Act performance measure for this. 6, 7, 8, 10 have none.
Yes, so with the FAST Act, there's a very specific set of performance metrics that we look at from a performance management perspective. And then since we have that new performance management requirement through the FAST Act for a set number of specific metrics, we wanted to take a look at our planned performance measures, which we project into the future, and see where we had measures that we could better consolidate the definition with the FAST Act metrics so that we're not looking at monitoring one thing and then projecting something slightly different, where we have the opportunity to sort of have it same across the board, both for monitoring and then modeling.
Any questions or comments?
The report is good.
Okay, thank you for your input.
Yeah. On to number 9, it's Sue. This is the TIP amendment number 9. Good morning.
At its January 26th meeting, the Statewide Board of Directors is scheduled to approve amendment number 9 to the 2016 Regional Transportation Improvement Program. I'd just like to take a minute to go back to review what is the primary purpose of the RTIP and the ITOP's role within the RTIP. The RTIP fulfills a federal requirement that is placed on each MPO for federal highways to approve an E76 to proceed with a phase of work using federal dollars. The funds must be programmed on that project and phase in the RTIP. Similarly, when requesting an allocation from CTC for state funds, they must also be programmed in the RTIP on the phase and in the year in order to proceed, to receive authorization to proceed. Section 6 of the Transnet ordinance required that the Regional Transportation Commission approve a 5-year program of projects using Transnet funds that are also included in the RTIP, and it also allows them to amend that program. So before those funds can be paid to a local agency, they must be programmed in the first 2 years or the biennial of that program of projects. The ITOG is asked to review and comment on the RTIP, specifically on the eligibility of projects and focusing on significant cost increases and or scope changes on major corridor projects included in the expenditure. Amendment number 9 is the regularly scheduled quarterly amendment, and it's detailed in the discussion section of the report beginning on page 2. The changes in this amendment are primarily a result of a new listing from the state for the Highway Bridge Program and the programming of active transportation program cycle 3 augmentation state and regional awards. In addition, City of Escondido made programming changes as a result of their Transnet financial audit. The City of San Diego adjusted programming based on project needs, and changes to Caltrans and Sandac projects are based on approved budget changes. The most notable change that impacts the Transnet program in this amendment is the update to Cal 29B on page 7 of your agenda. In this project, we replaced Transnet Major Corridors funding with Transnet Highways from the original Transnet ordinance in order to utilize the remaining funds for the original Transnet ordinance, which had been called at Sandbag. That's that's mostly what's going on in this amendment. I don't know if there are any other questions or comments for any other projects?
Comment, we discussed this a bit in our preparatory meeting before this, and I got overwhelmed by this, and this month I hit the wall. It was pointed out to me, and then you just reiterated here, our primary term that I talked to make a review based on 3 issues: the eligibility of the projects, whether there have been any significant cost increases, and whether there's any significant scope changes. And I think it would be very useful to summarize it. I mean, this massive detail that you guys have to manage is a tremendously complex issue. We're manipulating these dollars around timing-wise and everything. If we were just able to focus on those 3 issues in a summary page, details can follow if anybody's interested in trying to go to sleep at night. But eligibility, that's a one-time decision. And if the project shows up here, if there's a scope change or anything, I would assume the eligibility issue would only be raised if the expansion of the project was so great that might violate the eligibility criteria, which I assume would be a rare event. So then if we just focused on what project has significant cost increases or scope changes and a brief explanation of why, probably all we need to do to be able to pass judgment. But I'm not speaking for the rest of the committee. That's my thought of it.
I agree. Yeah, I don't think I know how to read this properly, so. Even though it has been explained.
So you would like to see a cover sheet that summarizes those
Just to speak
types
of
of
all
issues?
these changes, which are constantly, every program's got a little tweak here and there for a variety of reasons, and God knows how you guys keep track of all that. I don't need to know myself. I need to know the 3 responsibilities we have. Is there any change in why we deem it no longer eligible? If it's a new program, then we have to speak to why it's eligible. If it's an existing program, been deemed eligible. Why was there this significant cost increase? We need a definition of significant, and that would be both primarily in absolute dollars, not percentages, like in a Mickey Mouse project at elegant size, hopefully there, and what scope changes and why.
Yeah, we can work with them.
Without, we could still, we would still have to detail. I personally like to reference it for things at times, so I mean, I don't need to look at it every time. So I like your idea, but I don't want to lose it.
No, I agree with you.
Ability.
It's there for us to help them want to look something up.
Right. And I have great respect and sympathy for the fact that all of you guys put in a tremendous amount of time preparing reports for us and other committees in the board, and I hate to ask people to do more work. But to Dick's point, I mean, for the purposes as described, it would be helpful if there is a way to summarize these things. The other thing I would say, and I think this has come up in the past, you know, the word significant, which, and I presume this little paragraph is from the ordinance itself, personally, I would be very comfortable if we could actually define what significance is so that you don't necessarily have to bring everything to us.
Yeah,
and therefore have this volume of stuff which makes more difficult the process of reviewing it. And so, I don't know if you guys would agree that we could, as a committee, kind of create a working definition of what is significant so that we could screen out things, to Dick's point, and you know, whether, and I would suggest that we could at least consider a measure that is both a dollar measure as well as a percent change measure to operationally define significance. Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Yeah, maybe, is that something that would be reasonable for, you guys could review, you know,
Yeah, we can take a look at
the actual data that says.
typical kinds of projects and the typical changes to try to work on sort of a reasonable break point where you have reasonable, or excuse me, significant changes and, you know, minor changes.
Yeah, because, you know, in the scope of the dollars spent by this agency on projects, you know, having pages and pages of, you know, $10,000 moving here or there, I don't think it serves anybody's purpose to really spend time on that. So if you guys are willing to do that, that would be great.
Does that actually lessen your workload if you, because you guys are already doing these sheets anyway, are you not? So that's already being done, and Kai likes them, but I guess.
Well, there's no question,
I
it
agree
probably
that-
takes some more work,
But
but.
yeah, we have to do the same report for the transportation committee, so this is a subset.
And I would think going up the chain too, because, you know, I can't imagine how, whether it's transportation committee, the board, you know, to Dick's point, you sort of get something like this, and with, despite the best intentions that everybody has, it's just impossible not to have your eyes just gloss over on all this. I mean, what am I really supposed to be focused on here? So anything you could do to help, I think would enhance the integrity of the process.
Well, just to throw it out there, the table 3 that we added, the RTIP amendment change report, I could potentially add the change reasons on that report so that you can view that and then sort that in a different way so that certain change reasons float to the top, or certain changes, percent changes float to the top.
And I think if we could just exclude things that are under a certain dollar and percent change threshold, that would help as well. If you guys can make a recommendation, I would appreciate it.
A lot of the work that you see here, you know, the tables and everything, it's work that we need to do regardless.
I understand that,
And
but
I think what you're asking for, if I'm hearing you correct, is that you would like to have an easier way to figure out, okay, which projects are experiencing significant cost increases or scope changes or even eligibility questions. So I think what I'm hearing is just point them out to us, maybe like on the summary.
The one page?
The one pager, and then the remainder, I mean, we still need to do that. And that way you have all of the information if you want to be riveted by it, or, you know, you could just focus on those, you know, few projects.
Well, it's interesting, we can, and I agree with everything you're saying, but it's when we say $10,000 less can needle moving money from one project to another isn't significant, that's what we look at, but if somebody does $10,000 with senior mini grant change, we spend a half hour going over it, I mean, I just like to.
So it's section for the
Enough said.
Okay, let's see what we can do that.
Okay, thank you. Item number 10. Danielle, this is the update on transit operations funding.
Good morning. So Colleen's actually going to introduce this item.
Because I love doing introductions. So we know that over the last several months, we've been talking about the capital Transnet program, plan of finance. And what we're here to talk with you about today is the operations program and sort of the long-term view at that. These are the 8.1% of Transnet funds, revenues that are set aside to support operations and maintenance of the specific transit projects in Transnet. So we're interested in your thoughts on the different factors and assumptions used to look at the future. And as Danielle goes through the presentation, you'll see that a lot of the factors we're using are volatile, they're really difficult to predict. And so those are some of the things we kind of want to get out in the open about some of the challenges looking forward on how we continue to fund the transit projects. So she's going to go through the specific transit projects that we're talking about, how much money we actually have in the bank now, how much we're currently spending, and provide you an overview of the factors and assumptions that go into sort of trying to predict the ongoing needs and revenues into the future. So with that, I'll turn it over.
All right, so this slide details the 10 transit projects that are identified in the Major Corridors program. And I'm going to take you through each of them. Some of them you're probably pretty familiar with, others are kind of out in the future. So there are 4 that are currently in service, 3 that are currently under construction, and then 3 that are planned and out in the future. So you see the 4 that are existing is the Superloop Rapid, there we go, there's my mouse. The Superloop Rapid up in UTC, which is this circulator right here, serving UCSD and UTC Westfield. The Mid-City Rapid, I keep losing my mouse, is number 2 on the map. Oh, there it is. And this is the limited stop service that connects downtown to San Diego State. And then there are two I-15 rapid services, the Route 235 and the Route 237. The 235 going from Escondido to downtown. And then the Route 237, which is a peak period only service on weekdays that runs between the Rancho Bernardo Town Center and UC San Diego on Mira Mesa Boulevard. So the transit projects that are currently under construction is the South Bay Rapid Service, the red line down at the bottom, which connects the Otay Mesa border crossing in downtown San Diego using Interstate 805 and State Route 94. And that one's scheduled to launch in 2019. The Mid-Coast Trolley, which is scheduled to launch in 2021. That's going to extend the blue line up to UC San Diego and Westfield UTC. And the final project in this category is the coaster frequency enhancements. And so for frequency enhancements, what we're paying for is the incremental cost of operating additional trains so that the wait time for passengers is lessened. And then there are the three future transit projects. One is the South Bay Rapid Express, and so that's a planned route that's going to run during the peak periods on weekdays, connecting the San Ysidro border crossing to Sorrento Mesa using I-805, I-15 serving the Centerline stations, and then SR-52. And then also frequency enhancements on the Blue Line and Sprinter. So again, those frequency enhancements are paying for the incremental cost of additional buses or trains. So to date, the 8.1% of Transnet has yielded nearly $180 million to support the operations of these 10 routes. Of those, we've spent about $47 million, and so we currently have $133 million in reserves. When we originally began collecting money through Transnet, we only had the Superloop Rapid that was running. So in the beginning, the first few years of Transnet, we were collecting significant amounts of reserves. And then in fiscal year 2015, 3 additional rapid routes launched, the Mid-City Rapid and the 2 I-15 rapid services. And so since then, we've been spending about 50% of what we're collecting each year. So we're continuing to build a reserve, but not at the rate that we were back in 2009 and 2010. And so this reflects how we originally calculated when we were determining how much we would need to fund these routes. We anticipated, building up reserves in the beginning, and then as new services come online, we would start spending those reserves down. And of course, we have South Bay Rapid and Mid-Coast Trolley coming on in a few years here that are going to, start, eating up more of the pot. We have an agreement with MTS for operating the existing rapid routes, and according to this agreement, SANDAG reimburses MTS with these funds for the actual cost to operate and maintain these services, less the passenger fare that is collected from these routes. So the 2 revenue sources that are currently paying for these routes are Transnet and fare revenues, and we don't account for other revenues such as advertising or like naming rights. Those are currently not considered. And we've been working with MTS and NCTD about a year now to project costs and revenues through the end of the extension 2048. And there are a lot of different factors that make it difficult to project both the costs and the revenues. And I'm going to run through a few of those.
Just if I could ask, is it the case that other revenues are truly incidental? Like, would it even be like a percentage of the operating budget?
For the existing services, pretty incidental. Looking at the naming rights that's been sold for the Mid-Coast, it's called the UCSD line. That's more substantial.
And so where does that money go then? It's not counted into this formula.
Currently to MTS.
Interesting.
So that what?
What was your answer? I'm sorry.
To MTS, they collect the revenue and spend it.
But I thought, first question, I thought your real challenge here, and it strikes me as a significant challenge, is you got to balance all these unknown projections in the future with fare revenue and your fixed amount of an unknown revenue stream, tax revenue stream coming in. Now we're hearing there's yet a third stream. This is incidental stuff.
Yeah, so I guess the basic question is, so if, for example, the naming rights is a non-trivial amount of money, and it goes to MTS to be spent kind of however they want, as opposed to being spent in support of the operating costs of these lines.
Mm-hmm.
doesn't, that those incidental revenues don't reduce your commitment to fund their shortfall.
Correct.
Right now, if I'm understanding it, you're committed to fund whatever their shortfall is.
Right.
You have to fund it until you run out of money.
Well, not necessarily. I think what we're doing right now is we're trying to anticipate what the continued revenue needs will be throughout 2048. There's lots of variables in that, and I think the commitment would be we would work together with MTS if there is a shortfall to try to figure out how to cover that. But currently, any revenues beyond just fares and what we're collecting through Transnet, any other revenues through naming or advertising, all goes to MTS to use, on other services throughout the network. So that is that's a policy question that could be discussed.
Yeah, and just out of curiosity, is it because at the time this deal was struck, it wasn't viewed that there would be ancillary revenues of note, so it simply wasn't included, or was there some real discussion about that, and this is just the way the negotiation ended up? Does anybody know?
I kind of have a little bit of background, but basically the reason, my impression, and I wasn't part of the conversation, is that the very first route to begin was Superloop, and at the time, the advertising revenue that would have been created for Superloop was really kind of supplanting advertising revenue that other routes would have made, because the service was basically replacing other services. It wasn't, there were, the shelters, for example, were already being used for other routes, and so they didn't see it as an additional service creating additional streams of revenue, so it was more kind of supplanting. So I think, that was when the original discussion happened. Then as the rapid service, if you look at the 215, it's kind of the same thing. Route 7 used to go in the same corridor, and so they've been able to reduce some of that service and kind of allocate it elsewhere as the Route 215 came on. And so, kind of I think, the discussion kind of becomes more relevant as, Midcoast comes on and things that are truly additional service.
Thanks.
So I'm going to take you through some of these factors that have made it very challenging, as you recognize, to calculate out the costs. Operation costs are very volatile. From year to year, there's changes to labor agreements, changes to fuel prices, and also claims that may cause operating costs to go up or down from year to year. And then also the major factor in determining operating costs are the service levels. And the service levels are adjusted in response to demand. So if more people are riding, you put more service out there. If less people are riding, you take out. Looking out to the future, emerging technologies may have a significant impact on future transit operations costs. Talking about autonomous vehicles or electrification of vehicle fleets, those could have a pretty large impact. And also, since technology may change the way we travel, it's also hard to predict out what levels of service are going to be needed in these routes in 2035, 2040. And then a final factor that makes things complicated is looking at the time frame going all the way out to 2048. Since the horizon is so far away, when we were trying to project out costs, very small changes in the current year have a huge impact because it's compounded year after year after year. You're very familiar, with how complicated it is to do just the revenue portion of it for Transnet. Now we're bringing in operating costs and a lot of other things. So the final other things,
How do you do it? I understand it's very complicated. It's out of my mind how you get comfortable that you have a reasonable feel looking for all those variables out in 30 years. Mind-boggling.
Yeah, right now, we're not feeling comfortable, and that's kind of why we wanted to give this update and let you know that it's something that we're definitely working on.
I think part of the answer there is that you need to do it frequently. Right? So I mean, you develop a certain number of assumptions, and you're going to have an assumption for what's going to happen a year from now and 2 years from now, and so a year from now or 2 years from now, you compare your assumptions versus your actual performance, and then you figure out, okay, we need to make some adjustments, or our assumptions are pretty reasonable, so let's continue them. So, I mean, it's one of those things where you can just
tremendous challenge. This is back to a point we discussed briefly somewhat before today, in that can we increase ridership by significantly lowering the fares? And will you have enough money to make up that difference? And that's a function of projecting out. how rapidly will you burn through your existing reserves relative to what's coming in? How much play do we have with fares? It's an amazing equation. How to solve it.
Yeah, so speaking of fares, that's our last factor that we look at when trying to kind of get a handle on the SAL. And fare revenues are dependent on both the fare structure and also how much ridership the routes are receiving. Historically, fare changes haven't occurred at regular intervals. It's been about, I think, 8 years since our last fare change, which is a significant amount of time. And then the other thing is, recent trends have shown a downward trend in transit ridership. And we don't know if that's a short-term condition or if it's going to be more of a long-term trend. So that also makes it very challenging to try to predict out ridership to 2048. And as always, with transit revenues, there's some uncertainty in estimating future sales tax revenues since we can't predict the future economic conditions. So, just kind of to bring the point home that, there's lots of factors, lots of volatility, and, we're working to figure this out, and we'll talk about what our next steps will be as we try to move forward and come up with an answer.
Well, we are trying to work with the transit operators to try to resolve some of this, but I think there's other tools that we have in place. One is that I think you're aware that we're embarking on an update to the regional transportation plans, and that, that's a really broad look out and how we sort of look generally at revenues and projects and try to make all of that match up. The second area is looking at the 10-year, Transnet 10-year look forward. So we've heard about the look back, now looking forward. That's a little bit shorter term. 10 years is, you can do a little bit more predictions in a shorter time frame. And then also really relying on the annual budget process that the transit agencies do every year. And so those are shorter term looks, maybe 2-year look out, and trying to bring all of those things together. And as Jose said, just continue to monitor it on a more frequent basis as we go forward. So we're going to continue to work with the transit operators on this and just try to keep really close tabs on it and report to you as we make progress.
The transit operators are independent entities in and of themselves, is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So if I'm one of them, I'm sitting there and I have control over my fare rates. That's my decisions, it's not SANDAG.
SANDAG has a role in setting the fare policy, so if they're going to change fares, then the SANDAG Board of Directors has a role in approving those fare changes.
SANDAG's approval.
Yes, yes.
But I sit there and I recognize that my source of revenues are really for getting the ancillary stuff, which is my fares and whatever you're giving me. And what you're giving me is you're going to give me everything you get. None of us know what you're going to get, but whatever you get, you give me. My fares, and I know what I'm controlling my costs, so it seems to me the district have a tremendous interest in this model you're working on.
Yes. Yeah.
Because that's my daily future. I can't control anything other than what you give me.
That's right.
You're right.
So if you can just go back to the slide that had the list of the components of the cost forecast for a second. You know which slide I'm referring to?
I think it's the list of the different.
Where you list labor and.
Sorry. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, there you go. So under the list of those operating cost components.
2 forward.
One more forward. One more.
Okay,
there we go.
So for example, so you have a model that has go forward assumptions for each of these factors, correct?
But we did create a model like that last year, and we brought it to you last year, and we've been kind of looking at a more appropriate way to track this now.
Gotcha. Okay. Because I was going to say, and I don't know if having us get into the granularity of this really helps you much, but in order to actually provide feedback, I mean the overall approach sort of makes sense, as it seems somewhat intuitive, but understanding like what kind of assumptions you have here, and we may not be the body that's best prepared to give you feedback, but going back to the whole issue about forecasts and modeling with regard to SANDAG, are you looking to any outside experts for feedback on the assumptions in this model? There may be nationally recognized experts in transit service costs or things of that nature, or just other systems, to get a sense that the kind of assumptions that you're using here are reasonable assumptions?
So to date, we had brief conversations with like a national expert related to fare revenue.
Okay.
And we had discussed, potentially going out, and bringing on some, consultant or expert help and really taking a deep dive. But I think we need to get a little bit further along where we're at right now, because we've really recognized that the model that we were previously using has, some shortfalls that we really need to figure out a better way to do ongoing management of this money and looking, like Jose said, kind of a shorter horizon and ongoing, coming back more frequently. And so I think, once we have, working with the transit operators, a better idea of, what the format of this is going to look like, that's when we would talk about, the assumptions and looking out for some external help.
You got a lot of historical data, these statistics have a lot of historical data, and every one of those is useful for you, taking your range of projections out in the future.
I think two big factors that are so different is that the downward trend nationally that we're seeing in transit ridership is a big factor, and sort of the onset of technology and how that affects public transit moving forward. So as we're seeing a greater use of people using Uber and Lyft, and what role that plays in public transit is still really emerging. And so those two factors are things that we really haven't seen before and seem to, we don't know if they're blips or if it's really a long-term thing. So even looking back tells us something, but it doesn't sort of tackle these two big issues that I think all transit agencies are dealing with throughout the nation.
You said nationally, transit ridership is falling.
Yes. Nationally, it's falling.
So
and yeah.
If you look back over time, does transit ridership tend to reflect cyclicality at all, that as the economy improves, maybe people have more money that they're more comfortable spending it on
And
driving
gas
as opposed to
prices.
gas prices, those sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, ups and downs. It's somewhat cyclical. There was the big boom in like 2009 when gas prices were very high and employment wasn't doing well, and but I think that this, what we've seen the last few years is not expected per se in, kind of what we've typically seen in ridership trends.
I think
It probably
we've
relates
always
to traffic too, because if you look at the charts or refer to the charts they showed us at the beginning, it's like San Francisco went way up in ridership of transit, the BART or whatever, because their traffic and their jobs are like growing so much that people are like, I'm not going to use my car, I'm going to get on transit. So I think there's more than just one factor.
Right.
It's disturbing to me to hear, and it's an allegation, I don't know whether it's proven, that the innovation of Uber is reducing transit.
we don't know.
That's
just a factor. Yeah.
Because
I see it
obviously
replacing
the idea of
taxis,
transit is
not
to get
trains.
cars off the street, clean the air, so on and so forth, and Uber doesn't either of those. And that's really what the net result is. It's unfortunate from this overall goal of trying to increase use of transit.
Right.
And so is there, on a national level, is there nobody out there doing polling to try to query commuters as to what's going on?
Oh, that data collection is going on right now. So transit ridership has typically always been gradually going up, and it goes up higher as gas prices or, if there's certain things that happen. This is the first time we've seen this happening. And so there's data collection going on with the Ubers and Lyfts. The other thing is they're kind of proprietary on their information as well. So a lot of it is just, public opinion surveys, trying to go out and get that sort of data. Cars even cheap to buy is another thing people are thinking could be a factor. As urban areas become places where more people with more wealth want to live, they're less inclined to maybe ride transit. And so there's lots of different factors. And we don't know exactly what they are, but yes, there's work underway to try to collect that data.
Another challenge.
Yes. Thank you very much. So, next meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, Valentine's Day.
You should have tags that you can drop that out.
Yeah.
Speaking of schedules, you can refer to the Sandag Board retreat.
Yeah, that's on the, that's, like the 9th and 10th, something like that?
The
9th and
9th.
10th?
If you have time, typically there's stuff, there's a lot of good stuff.
When and where.
We can send you the agenda. It's a 3-day event. Begins on a Wednesday afternoon. I can't remember the exact date.
It's like the 7th and 8th.
February 7th to the 9th. And it's at Verona. And we can send you the agenda. Yeah.
If I could just throw one thing out there for a potential agenda item for our next meeting, which is the communication strategy for us as a committee. It came up in the context of we've got the triennial performance report, and I'd be curious to have some discussion as to what, if any, communication strategy there is about the releasing of that report, or trying to get people to see it and read it, or at least just as a topic for consideration, unless people think that that's not a useful idea.
Okay, so did you want us to bring kind of like some options on how we would communicate?
Well, first of all, I'm just
results,
curious
or-
what happens to it, whether it's just put on the website as a link and you're lucky if you find
I
it,
see what
or
you're
if
saying.
there's actually any kind of communication strategy around it.
So the schedule, right? We're coming in April to your April meeting with a draft. Then it goes to Transportation Committee, as you know. Then the results are, if we wait for feedback, there's the 60-day comment period right after the Transportation Committee meeting, which puts us in July, at your July meeting, when you would adopt the final or accept the final report of the performance audit. And then the results of it get summarized into the ITALC annual report, which we will have an item on one of your upcoming agendas. In the case that you would like to form a subcommittee again to talk about that annual report like you did last year, and kind of give you a little bit more time, since we thought that was necessary last time. And so that's kind of, it does reside on the website, on the Transnet webpage, the performance audit does. There's kind of some downloads way at the bottom, and all of past performance audit as well as fiscal audits, everything is kind of listed there, for each year. I think
Is that what
in the
you're getting
past-
at, or?
He wants for the publication.
So my hurdle question was,
Yeah.
is there a communication
So more
strategy
like-
around it? And you've just described what's done. I'm not suggesting we hire a PR firm and spend lots of money to promote it, but at least for me as an individual, as I reflect back on the past, getting close to 2 years now, it strikes me that the public understanding of what we do, and particularly of the ITALC role, is something that is not very prevalent. It just makes me wonder if part of our responsibility to the public should be to try to be more communicative. And so that was, and again, the triennial reviews seem to be something that is relevant in that regard. And so it just made me wonder, like I said, first, is there any communication strategy? And then secondly, if it's something we want to talk about as, is something that we might want to enhance or not.
Sure.
Yeah, and just to introduce a member of the SANDAG team, we have Eileen from our communications department. So I'm glad that she's hearing your comments, so that we can strategize and brainstorm options.
Great, thanks.
So, do we have to have a motion for adjournment?
No.
Oh, wait.
Maybe you do, but before you do, do we want to address the question of whether we want any formal response to the 10-year look-back report?
Okay.
Yeah, so again, the options are, you can certainly, put together a memo with the help of the Schoberg team and staff that then could be kind of attached to the 10-year when we go to the board. Or you could kind of convey your recommendations through the performance audit, which we will definitely do anyways. And then in addition, we're definitely going to take your comments from today and incorporate them into the board report, just like we will for the other committees that have weighed in along the way this month so far as they've reviewed the 10-year report. So those comments are definitely going to the board at the end of this month. if you want an additional memo, that's certainly an option, but your recommendations are definitely making their way to the board regardless.
We didn't do the memo, and we incorporated the annual report. When would the board see those particular comments on the 10-year review?
So
What our
I think,
timing?
yeah, I think the comments on the 10-year review, we're looking for those sooner rather than later, because really, aside from any changes that may be made to the expenditure plan, which will be made through the regional plan efforts, there's other future considerations that the board should be looking at sooner rather than later, as standalone items perhaps, then we'll be looking to, take those as necessary.
So my assumption is you have additional comments?
It would be my thought that, if nothing else, to display the role we are mentioning to play here, as I talked to the board, that we read this report, and the one extreme is we read it, we endorsed it, knocked ourselves out, or two, we read it, we thought it was very comprehensive, so-and-so, but it raised these issues, and we are recommending that these issues be looked at. And if I was to write it, to a degree, I would read something like the preamble that was a well-written report, comprehensive, but it raised a list of issues that we think necessitate further study. And one, maybe not a priority, but the safety of the bike and pedestrian things got the worse. Do we understand the data? Why? What can be done about it? How should we use our knowledge in the future to improve that situation? The congestion relief, we got 2% worse. We don't see that number somewhat out of context. We don't know what the population growth is and the use of the highways is. Give us a better picture of are things really better or worse given all the money we've spent. The other issue is we've accelerated all these projects and made great progress on all of the designated priority projects. We've done that at the expense of having dollars available in the future. It's recognized we're going to a pay-as-you-go. I would think a table that would show, based on range forecast, the best case, worst case, what the revenues are going to be, what percentage of the money that would normally come to major projects is remaining for new projects versus what percentage has to go to pay for all the acceleration we already done, just to keep people focused on that decision that has been made. That would be my thoughts for what at a minimum would be a letter that would accompany the report to the board.
So it sounds like we should work together. We should draft a memo. What would be the best process? Use this existing.
Sounds like Dick has an
triennial
initial draft.
Yeah.
About 40% complete. You just.
Well, I just took some notes very well. I'll try to type this up. That's difficult. And email it to you so you can try to incorporate something. I assume you'd have to cycle back to us to approve.
Yeah, we could either do that, the chair and the vice chair could kind of take the lead.
Well, there's a Brown Act
the
issue
rest.
in terms of doing
Right.
all of it. But,
Exactly. Well, if
we
it's the.
can choose to delegate it to the chair to sign off on it.
Well, if I can make a suggestion, perhaps there's a date by which we could all forward any thoughts and comments to, I don't know, whether the chair, staff, or whomever, which can then be summarized.
Yes, certainly, and then I could incorporate it into my report that goes to the board, so the written report, as opposed to having a separate memo. The challenge with the separate memo, which we can still do, is that mail out for the board meeting is next Friday. So
let's
coordination, and making sure everybody,
Let's do your first suggestion of incorporate those comments into yours. So we would send our comments directly to Ariana.
Yes, and if you could
As long
send
as it's
those.
very clearly that this is what the ITOC committee included.
Oh, for sure, it will be, yes.
Well, just
And the other committees.
by Friday, you mean not Friday 2 days from now, but a week from this Friday.
That's when we actually mail it out, which means it needs to be ready ahead of that time.
What would your ready date
It would be great to have it, end of this week if possible. I'd say, early, at the latest, early next week.
And just for clarity, in your reporting of anything related to ITAC to the board, does that get done in a manner similar to as you read to us the highlights from the board meeting, or is it actually part of a formal written report on your part?
No, it can be both. So definitely the written report those will be written, those will be captured in the report in writing.
Okay.
Depending on the amount of time at the meeting itself, there may or may not be time to go through each and every comment that we've received, but they will definitely be captured in the written portion. We may be able to kind of highlight as part of our speaking points. And certainly if you'd like for us to verbally bring up
And presumably, if for emphasis, our vice chair wanted to actually present those comments
Definitely be
directly
there
at the
in
meeting,
person.
you would
Yes.
be welcome to.
It's another way. Yeah.
To get your 1 minute of
See what you
comments at the meeting.
You might think I'd be welcome, but they might not.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
So, Friday.
That would be great. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't, you already know.
Okay.
No, I move motion.
All right.
We need a motion.
Adjourned.
Oh, there's a lot of stuff.
Let's get on.